Hey there, tonight we're setting sail on the Nile to uncover what sailing was like in ancient Egypt, where the truth is, those majestic vessels relied more on muscle than mythical winds. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. You wake up to the sound of bustling activity outside your mud-brick home, the sun already casting its golden glow over the bustling docks of the Nile. It's the ancient world's equivalent of rush hour. Merchants shout, sailors grunt as they load cargo, and the air is thick with the earthy smell of the river mixed with the tang of fish. Welcome to your day in ancient Egypt, where the Nile isn't just a river. It's the very backbone of civilization, the original highway of commerce and culture. Now, before you get swept up in the romance of it all, let's get one thing straight. Not everyone here is a master sailor. It's not like every Egyptian was born with sea legs. Some of these folks are just trying to keep their heads above water, quite literally. Sure, there were some seasoned sailors navigating the waters with the confidence of a modern-day Uber driver, but many were more akin to someone trying to parallel park for the first time. Boats were vital, but they were also hard work. Speaking of boats, let's talk money. If you're in the market today, you've got options. On the cheaper end of the spectrum, there's the papyrus skiff. Lightweight, easy to build, and perfect for shallow waters. Think of it as the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a bicycle. Cheap, efficient, and you won't be winning any races against the larger vessels. A small papyrus boat might set you back a few deben of copper. Deben being the currency of the time. It's like saying a handful of loose change, but in a way that buys you something more than just a pack of gum. But if you've got dreams and the means of grandeur, eye up a cedarwood vessel. Think of the difference like going from a beat-up clunker to a luxury sedan. These boats are the stuff of legend, used by pharaohs and high officials. Imported cedar from Lebanon, these beauties could cost you upwards of several hundred deben of copper. They're not just boats, they're statements. They say, I'm important, and I've got the wood to prove it. The economics of boat building wasn't just about luxury versus necessity. It was the lifeline of trade. Egypt was a trading powerhouse, and the Nile was its superhighway. Goods flowed in and out like water through a sieve. Grain, gold, papyrus, and linen were shipped downriver, while exotic goods like myrrh, incense, and precious stones flowed back. Trade routes weren't just lines on a map. They were networks of influence, connecting Egypt with far-flung places like Nubia, Punt, and the Mediterranean world. Of course, all this trade meant politics were never far behind. Whoever controlled the Nile controlled Egypt's lifeblood. The river wasn't just a route. It was a political tool, a means to project power and influence over vast distances. Imagine being able to control the flow of wealth into a country by simply managing a waterway. That's the kind of power the pharaohs wielded, and it was formidable. But let's not get too carried away by the grand vision of a well-oiled trading machine. In reality, navigating the Nile came with its own set of challenges. The river could be unpredictable, with its annual floods being both a boon and a bane. Too much water, and you're looking at destruction. Too little, and famine looms. The ancient Egyptians had to be savvy, reading the river's mood like a grizzled sailor reads the weather. And while the Nile was a political tool, it was also a great equalizer. The river didn't care if you were a pharaoh or a fisherman. It demanded respect. Boats capsized, storms brewed, and the ever-present threat of crocodiles meant every journey had its risks. It wasn't all smooth sailing, quite literally. The romantic image of a serene river journey often glosses over the harsh realities of life on the water. As you navigate the docks, you might overhear craftsmen debating the merits of different boat designs. The ancient Egyptians were nothing if not resourceful. Papyrus was plentiful and cheap, but for those long hauls, the sturdiness of a wooden boat couldn't be beat. It's a balance of cost, efficiency, and purpose, a conversation that echoes even in today's world of fuel efficiency and electric vehicles. By mid-morning, you're swept into the rhythm of the docks. The clamor of trade, the shouts of sailors, and the ever-present hum of the river are a symphony that underscores daily life. Trade wasn't just about goods. It was about connections, alliances, and the ever-shifting sands of power. Control the river, and you control the narrative of history. It's a story that's as old as time, yet as relevant as ever. So as you stand there, the sun climbing higher in the sky, take a moment to appreciate the sheer magnitude of it all. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was a lifeline, a highway, and a stage for the unfolding drama of ancient Egypt. And as you prepare to step onto your own vessel, remember that while not every Egyptian was a master sailor, each played a part in this epic tale of commerce, politics, and survival on the storied waters of the Nile. Now, as the sun kisses the morning goodbye, and you step onto your vessel, let's talk about the crew. Brace yourself for a reality check. The life of an ancient Egyptian sailor was less master and commander, and more survivor. Nile edition. Forget the Hollywood fantasy of a heroic captain with a tricorn hat and a penchant for dramatic speeches. The actual captain, or Hurry-Tep, was more likely focused on keeping the boat afloat and the crew in line. This wasn't a position of leisure. It was a juggling act of managing people, cargo, and the whims of the river guards. The crew hierarchy was as straightforward as it was stringent. At the top sat the captain, who bore the unenviable responsibility of navigation and decision-making. Beneath him, the quartermaster took charge of the ship's supplies, which, trust me, was no small task. With the limited storage space and the need to ration food and water meticulously, this role was as vital as it was thankless. The rest of the crew were the oarsmen and deckhands, who did the heavy lifting, literally, were the ones sweating under the unforgiving sun, rowing those hefty vessels and handling the ropes and sails. And while we're on the topic, let's debunk another myth. Rowing wasn't a glamorous workout session. No sleek gym equipment here, folks. Instead, imagine a grueling, repetitive motion that would make even the most hardcore fitness enthusiast reconsider their life choices. With muscles burning and the sun beating down, it was more feel the burn than feel the breeze. Now, let's talk about the fine line between the cruises of the elite and the daily grind of the common sailor. For the upper echelons of society, a trip down the Nile wasn't so much about getting from point A to point B as it was about flaunting wealth and enjoying a floating paradise. Picture luxurious barges with awnings for shade, plush cushions, and servants attending to every whim. The rich would be sipping wine, fermented grape juice, if we're being honest, while feasting on delicacies. Not quite the all-you-can-eat buffet, but a far cry from the common sailor's fare. For the average sailor, meals were less gourmet and more get-by. Barley bread, onions, and dried fish were the staples, washed down with beer. And before you get visions of frothy mugs, remember this was more like a thick, nutritious porridge than a refreshing lager. The good news, it was packed with calories. The bad news, well, it was packed with calories. Let's just say, no one's writing home about the culinary experience on board. But whether you're a high-born noble taking in the sights or a deckhand trying to avoid sunstroke, there's no escaping the river's demands. The Nile was a powerful equalizer, indifferent to social status. A sudden storm could wreak havoc, and the infamous river bends required skill and quick reflexes to navigate without ending up keel over hull. You could say the real captain of any vessel was the Nile itself, and it didn't take orders. As you sail down this ancient artery of commerce and culture, it's crucial to appreciate the economic context. These vessels weren't just floating homes. They were the beating heart of Egypt's economy. Every piece of cargo represented wealth, trade, and a connection to the broader world. The stakes were high. Lose a shipment of grain, and you risk famine. Misplace a cargo of gold, and you're facing financial ruin. The pressure to deliver was as relentless as the river's current. The politics of the Nile were equally turbulent. Pharaohs might have ruled with an iron fist, but the river was the real power broker. Controlling the waterways meant controlling the flow of goods, people, and influence. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy and strategy, with the captain as the unwitting partner trying to keep in step. So, as you stand on the deck, taking in the sights and sounds of this floating world, remember that every ripple in the water tells a story. It's a tale of ambition, survival, and the relentless march of history. The Nile was more than just a river. It was a crucible of civilization, shaping the lives of those who dared to navigate its waters. And as you sail onward, you become part of that timeless narrative, a thread woven into the rich tapestry of Egypt's storied past. As the afternoon sun starts to glare down on your vessel, casting long shadows over the shimmering waters of the Nile, it's time to tackle the age-old question. How did the ancient Egyptians navigate these waters without Google Maps or even a basic compass? Buckle up, because we're about to dive deep into the innovative minds of the ancients who used the cosmos as their compass and the sun as their guide. First off, let's address a common misconception. Ancient Egyptian sailors didn't just wing it, hoping the gods would steer them right. Navigating the Nile required a blend of astronomy, geology, and let's face it, a bit of luck. The Egyptians were no strangers to the stars, and they were especially chummy with the North Star, or what they called the indestructible star. This wasn't just for gazing at during romantic river cruises. These stars were their guiding lights, literally. The North Star remained fixed in the sky, providing a reliable point of reference. Now the Egyptians didn't have a sextant. Who needs one when you've got a merkit? This little gadget, which sounds like a piece of IKEA furniture, but is actually an ancient timepiece, was the real MVP. The merkit, a simple siding tool made of a wooden bar with a plumb line, allowed them to measure the angles of the stars. It's like using a protractor, but with way more at stake than getting your geometry homework right. But let's not forget the sun. In the absence of a wristwatch, the sun was the ultimate clock. High noon was easy to spot. The sun was directly overhead, making it a reliable, albeit scorching, marker of time. Using the sun's position, an experienced sailor could estimate both the time of day and their direction. Of course, this meant that cloudy days were about as welcome as a hole in your boat. And let's not ignore the Nile itself. The river's flow was a natural GPS, directing vessels north towards the Mediterranean. Going south against the current was a different beast altogether, requiring sails and some serious manpower at the oars. The riverbanks, with their familiar landmarks, were like ancient road signs, helping sailors chart their course. Every bend and twist of the Nile was a chapter in an ever-changing story that only the most seasoned sailors could read. Now, onto the myths that have plagued the seas like a bad case of barnacles. While we love a good sea monster story, who doesn't enjoy a bit of fantasy? The real threats weren't mythical beasts, but very earthly dangers. Ancient texts rarely mention anything like the kraken or leviathan. Instead, they feared the unpredictable weather. A sudden storm could capsize boats faster than you can say, "Oh, Osiris." And a foggy morning was more likely to lead to a shipwreck than any serpent lurking beneath the waves. But let's not pretend the Nile was a serene waterway. Enter the crocodiles. These toothy terrors were the real deal, often lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to make a meal of an unwary sailor. These weren't the oversized handbags you might imagine. Nile crocodiles could grow up to 20 feet long, and let's just say they weren't shy about making their presence known. Forget sea monsters. In ancient Egypt, it was the crocodile you had to watch out for. And while we're debunking myths, let's talk about those exaggerated tales of Egyptian voyages across the open seas. Yes, Egyptians sailed the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, but let's not get carried away imagining them as the ancient world's answer to Columbus. Their ships were primarily designed for river travel, not oceanic exploration. The few that dared to venture beyond the familiar shores were the exception, not the rule. But why let facts get in the way of a good story, right? The romance of sea monsters and heroic journeys appeals to our love of adventure, even if the truth is less glamorous. Ancient Egypt was a land of innovation and resourcefulness, where imagination met practicality at the water's edge. As you sail along, contemplating the balance between myth and reality, it's clear the ancient Egyptians were masters of adaptation. They used every tool at their disposal, from the stars above to the river below, creating a navigational system that was as impressive as it was effective. So next time you find yourself lost without GPS, spare a thought for those who steered their course by the light of the stars and the flow of the mighty Nile. The sun dips lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the river as you continue your journey, ever aware of the delicate dance between nature's whims and human ingenuity. Whether navigating by starlight or sunlight, the Nile sailors were part of a grand tapestry, one that wove together the stories of gods and men, myths and realities. And as you sail on, you become part of that timeless journey, carried by the same currents that once bore the dreams and ambitions of an ancient civilization. As the Nile's currents carry you forward, let's shift gears and explore how sailing wasn't just about commerce and survival. It was deeply entwined with the spiritual and cultural life of ancient Egypt. Buckle up, because we're diving into a world where boats weren't just practical. They were the VIP lounge for pharaohs and guards alike. First things first, forget everything you know about depictions of Egyptian rituals in movies. This ain't The Mummy or some Technicolor extravaganza. The truth is even wilder. Boats were essentially the ancient world's stretch limo, reserved for guards and kings to make their grand entrances and exits. If you were a pharaoh, your boat wasn't just a mode of transport. It was an extension of your divine persona. The grandiose boat processions on the Nile were the ancient equivalent of a red carpet event, where your status was flaunted with the subtlety of a peacock on a parade. Consider the famous Bark of Ammon, a sacred vessel housed in the Karnak temple. This wasn't just any boat. It was a gilded masterpiece, adorned with gold and precious stones, designed to carry the statue of the god Ammon during festivals. We're talking about a floating temple, a divine yuba that transported not just a deity, but also the hopes and prayers of an entire civilization. Now, the Hollywood version might show a solemn procession, but imagine the practicalities. Hauling this colossal bark required manpower, coordination, and let's face it, a prayer that no one would drop the divine cargo. Now, why all this fuss over a boat, you ask? Because for the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was more than just a river. It was a cosmic highway. Their mythology painted the Nile as a reflection of the Milky Way, a celestial river that connected the earth with the heavens. Every boat journey was seen as a microcosm of the soul's journey through the afterlife. The stakes were high. Navigate successfully, and you'd secure a spot in the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise, where the beer flowed and the barley grew tall. Let's not forget the average Joe, the average Neferhotep, who wasn't exactly sailing in gold-plated glory. For the common Egyptian, boats were also a crucial part of their funeral rites. Tombs were often equipped with model boats, meant to ensure the deceased a smooth sail into eternity. These weren't just toy models. They were the spiritual equivalent of a first-class ticket to the afterlife. Forget the pyramid. What you really wanted was a model boat, ensuring you didn't have to paddle your way into paradise. But here's where the myth-busting comes in. While it's tempting to picture every Egyptian's afterlife as a luxurious cruise, the reality was far grimmer. For many, the journey was fraught with challenges. The afterlife was a bureaucratic nightmare that made the DMV look like a cakewalk. Your heart was weighed against the feather of Mad, the goddess of truth, to determine if you were worthy. Fail, and you were devoured by Amit, a fearsome creature with the body of a lion and the head of a crocodile. Talk about a tough crowd. And while the pharaohs were busy commissioning elaborate funeral boats, their subjects were left hoping their model boats weren't made by the ancient equivalent of cut-rate manufacturers. The truth was, most Egyptians couldn't afford the elaborate funerary goods we see in museums. Many just hoped their souls could hitch a ride with the sun god Ra, who sailed across the sky by day and through the underworld by night. Speaking of Ra, here's another nugget. The sun god was thought to sail in two boats, the Manjet, or morning boat, and the Messic Tet, or evening boat. This cosmic commute underscored the Egyptian belief in rebirth and renewal, with each day representing a victory over chaos. Ra's daily journey was a reminder of the cyclical nature of life and death, a theme that resonated deeply in Egyptian culture. So, while the romanticized image of serene boat processions holds a certain allure, the reality was a complex blend of politics, religion, and practical concerns. Pharaohs used these processions as political theater, reinforcing their divine right to rule and projecting power both to their subjects and to the gods. It was a subtle, yet powerful reminder that they weren't just rulers. They were gods on earth, steering their kingdom through the turbulent waters of fate. As you float down the Nile, it's clear that the river was more than just a physical entity. It was a living narrative, a tapestry woven with the threads of myth and reality, politics and spirituality. Each ripple told a story, each procession added to the rich fabric of Egyptian life. And as you sail onward, remember that every boat, from the grandest bark to the simplest papyrus skiff, carried with it the weight of dreams, hopes, and the relentless pursuit of eternity. The sun begins its descent, casting an amber glow over the river, and you're left to ponder the intricate dance between life and afterlife, the sacred and the mundane. In this ancient world, sailing wasn't just a journey. It was a passage through the very heart of existence, a voyage that transcended time and space. And as the horizon swallows the last light of day, you become acutely aware that this journey, laden with history and mystery, is just beginning. As the horizon swallows the last light of day, casting long shadows on the Nile, you're left contemplating the legacy of those ancient Egyptian sailors who navigated not just the river, but the tides of history itself. It's tempting to pigeonhole the Egyptians as just pyramid fanatics, stacking stones in the desert like a cosmic game of Jenga. But let's dig deeper and unravel a legacy that stretches far beyond those towering behemoths. First up, let's talk influence. The Egyptians were the original maritime innovators, setting the stage for future seafaring cultures. Their mastery over the Nile, with its intricate currents and seasonal floods, taught them more than just how to navigate. It was a masterclass in adaptability and ingenuity. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll find their techniques echoed in the sailing practices of the Phoenicians, Greeks, and even the Romans. The Egyptians didn't just float their boats. They set sail on a tide of technological and cultural exchange that shaped the Mediterranean and beyond. Take the Phoenicians, for example. These ancient mariners took a leaf out of Egypt's papyrus scrolls, using similar navigation techniques to conquer the high seas. They didn't just emulate, they innovated, creating robust vessels capable of withstanding the harshness of open waters. But the roots of this maritime prowess reach back to the Nile, where Egyptian sailors first learned to harness the wind and read the stars. It's like they passed the baton of seafaring knowledge through the annals of time, each culture adding their own flair to the mix. Now, let's not forget the Romans, those road-building, toga-wearing conquerors. They might have had the infrastructure of the ancient world down to a fine art, but their naval ambitions were another story. They looked to Egyptian and Greek ship designs when crafting their own fleets. The sleek, efficient lines of Egyptian ships influenced Roman naval architecture, proving that the Egyptians were more than just pyramid builders. They were blueprint makers for empires. Beyond technology, the Egyptians also influenced the very fabric of maritime culture. Their spiritual connection to the river as both a life-giver and a pathway to the afterlife seeped into the collective consciousness of those who followed. It's hard not to see parallels in later myths of sea voyages as spiritual journeys. Odysseus, anyone. The idea that a river or sea could be a metaphorical bridge between worlds has its roots in the Nile's sacred waters. But let's not sugarcoat it. The Egyptians weren't just spiritual sailors or savvy traders. They were also masters of propaganda. Pharaohs used grand naval processions to project power both divine and human, creating a narrative of control over nature and destiny. This wasn't just for show. It was a strategic playbook that leaders throughout history would follow. Call it the ultimate PR campaign, where the pharaoh's fleet was a floating billboard of authority and divinity. It's a reminder that history is often written by those who can steer the narrative, literally and figuratively. So, while the romantic image of Egypt is often dominated by monumental stone structures, the legacy of their sailors is equally monumental, albeit less visible. They were the unsung architects of maritime culture, crafting a legacy that would shape the ancient world and ripple through centuries. Their influence is like the undercurrent of a mighty river, unseen but undeniably powerful, guiding the course of history. Now, let's tackle the myths that persist like barnacles on the hull of history. We love the idea of the noble Egyptian sailor, a sun-kissed hero steering a majestic vessel through calm waters. It's a tale that sells well in textbooks and tourism brochures. But the reality was grittier. Ancient Egyptian sailors were more akin to blue-collar workers than mythic adventurers. They labored under harsh conditions, their hands calloused from ropes and oars, their days dictated by the whims of the river and the orders of their rulers. It was a tough gig, far removed from the romanticized images we're often fed. Yet, it's this very contrast between myth and reality that makes their story so compelling. History is, after all, a tapestry of tales spun from fact and fiction, where the truth is often an inconvenient footnote. The myths endure because they speak to our love of adventure and heroism, even if the reality was far more mundane. But it's in this space between legend and life where the true legacy of Egyptian sailors lies, a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the relentless quest for survival. As you stand there, the evening air cooling the day's heat, consider the broader implications. The Egyptians weren't just pyramid builders or sailors. They were innovators, storytellers, and strategists. Their legacy is a reminder that history isn't just a series of events, but a web of interconnected stories, each thread weaving a narrative that continues to shape our world. So, as you prepare to leave this ancient world behind, take with you the knowledge that the Egyptians left us more than monuments of stone. They bequeathed us a legacy of innovation, adaptability, and an enduring spirit that continues to inspire. Their story is a reminder that history is as much about the stories we tell as it is about the facts we uncover. And as the last light fades from the Nile, we're left with the realization that, much like the river itself, the legacy of these ancient sailors flows on, shaping the currents of time. It's the early 16th century, and France is bustling with the kind of energy you'd expect from a country trying to shake off the cobwebs of the Middle Ages, while also dodging the occasional outbreak of plague. Because, nothing says, "Welcome to the Renaissance," quite like a good old-fashioned pandemic. Amidst this chaos, we find the young and soon-to-be famous John Calvin, born in 1509 in the quaint town of Noyon, located about 100 kilometers north of Paris. Calvin, who would later become the father of Calvinism, was originally set on a path that was decidedly less theological and far more, shall we say, judicial. Calvin's early life was orchestrated by his father, Gerard Covin, a man who knew a good investment when he saw one. Gerard was a lawyer, and not so coincidentally the local bishop's secretary, which gave him a few insights into where the money was flowing. And let's be honest, in those days, the church wasn't just a place for spiritual enlightenment. It was also a pretty lucrative career path. So, with the precision of a modern-day helicopter parent, Gerard sent young John to study in Paris at the tender age of 14. For context, that's about the same age most teenagers today are trying to navigate algebra and acne, not the streets of medieval Paris. Now, the University of Paris was no ordinary institution. It was the Ivy League of its time, boasting alumni like Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard. It was a place where philosophy and humanism were duking it out with superstition and dogma. But life in Paris wasn't all chiseled statues and enlightened discourse. The city was a maze of narrow, winding streets, with sanitation that could only be described as medieval at best. Students like Calvin had to be as nimble as they were scholarly, dodging both academic pitfalls and, more literally, chamber parts being emptied from second-story windows. And then there was the wine. Ah, yes, the wine. You might think that being in France meant you were always just a sip away from a vineyard's finest, but the student experience was a bit more, shall we say, vinegary. The cheaper stuff was notorious for its ability to induce headaches, not transcendence. Yet, amidst all this, Calvin thrived, diving into his studies with the kind of fervor that would make even Hermione Granger look like a slacker. Initially, Calvin set his sights on a law degree, a decision that was part personal ambition and part economic strategy. The legal profession was booming, a beacon of stability and prosperity in a world that often seemed one rickety cartwheel away from chaos. But then, in a twist worthy of a Netflix drama, Calvin underwent a transformation more surprising than a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, or in this case, a lawyer morphing into a theologian. The legend goes that Calvin experienced a sudden religious call around 1533, a mystical moment of clarity that redirected his life towards the divine. But let's put down the incense and look at the facts. By this time, the Protestant Reformation was in full swing, shaking the very foundations of Catholic Europe. Martin Luther had already done his thing, nailing the seas and speaking truth to power. The religious landscape was shifting, and with it, the economic and social opportunities. It's easy to romanticize Calvin's conversion as a bolt from the blue, but consider the practicalities. The clergy was a field ripe with opportunity, especially for a bright mind like Calvin's. The economic pressures were very real. Joining the clergy wasn't just a spiritual decision, it was a career move. And let's not forget, the church offered a certain immunity from the more mundane concerns of life, like finding a job in a rapidly changing world. Calvin's shift from law to theology wasn't just a personal pivot, it was a reflection of the times. The University of Paris, like many European institutions, was a crucible of ideas where the old and new collided daily. Students were caught in the crossfire between tradition and reform, with professors who could be as dogmatic as they were enlightened. It was an academic battlefield, and Calvin was right in the thick of it, navigating the ideological minefields with a deftness that would later define his theological writings. In the midst of all this intellectual tumult, Calvin found himself drawn to the writings of humanists like Erasmus, whose critiques of the Church resonated deeply with the young scholar. It wasn't just about faith, it was about reason, and the two were not mutually exclusive. This was a time when questioning the established order wasn't just encouraged, it was necessary. Calvin's eventual embrace of Protestantism wasn't a rejection of Catholicism per se, but a pursuit of a purer, more reasoned faith. So there you have it. John Calvin, the early years. From dodging chamber pots and bad wine in Paris to his unexpected detour into theology, his story is a testament to the unpredictability of life in the 16th century. A time when a young man could set out to become a lawyer and end up reshaping the religious landscape of Europe. And if that isn't a reminder of how plans can change, I don't know what is. Calvin's detour into theology wasn't just a career pivot. It was a prelude to his grand entrance onto a stage that would test his mettle in ways law school exams never could. Fast forward a few years, and we find Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland, a city as picturesque as a postcard, but with a penchant for drama that rivaled any soap opera. Geneva was a hotbed of Protestant reform, a place where ideas were as freely traded as gossip, and Calvin was about to become its most notorious hall monitor. Geneva, in the 1540, was a city in the midst of a spiritual and civic identity crisis. The Protestant Reformation had taken root, but like any teenager going through a rebellious phase, it wasn't exactly sure what it wanted to be when it grew up. Enter John Calvin, with his no-nonsense approach to religion and governance, determined to turn this wayward city into a model of piety. Calvin's vision for Geneva was one of strict moral codes, a city where sin was kept on a tighter leash than a misbehaving puppy. Now, here's where the plot thickens. Calvin's Geneva wasn't just about saying your prayers and minding your manners. Oh no, it was about transforming everyday life into a perpetual Sunday service. Imagine living in a city where the fun police weren't just a metaphor, but an actual institution. Calvin, with his penchant for order, banned not only the obvious vices like gambling and excessive drinking, but also dancing, a pastime that had long made people forget their troubles, if only for a song or two. Even those colorful socks, the medieval equivalent of a bold fashion statement, were frowned upon. The man was on a mission to banish the blues, both literal and metaphorical. The citizens of Geneva, used to a bit more joie de vivre, were understandably miffed. Imagine the uproar today if the local government banned memes and TikTok dances. People didn't just grumble quietly into their tankards, they pushed back. In the eyes of many Genevans, Calvin was less a reformer and more a killjoy. His insistence on moral rigor put him at loggerheads with local leaders and everyday citizens alike. Yet, despite the resistance, Calvin remained steadfast. His determination to mold Geneva into a beacon of Protestant virtue was as unyielding as a Swiss watch was precise. Calvin's infamous consistory, a council that might as well have been called the Board of Buzzkill, was tasked with enforcing these moral edicts. This group of church leaders and laymen was responsible for keeping tabs on the populace, ensuring that everyone towed the line. Think of it as an early form of neighborhood watch. But instead of looking out for burglars, they were on the hunt for anyone daring to hum a tune or raise a pint in excess. The consistory held regular meetings where miscreants were hauled in for questioning, a spectacle that must have been as entertaining as it was intimidating. Calvin's own experiences with the consistory were far from smooth sailing. His insistence on strict adherence to his moral codes set off a series of clashes that nearly saw him booted from the city. In 1538, after a particularly heated disagreement over liturgical practices, and perhaps a few too many crackdowns on revelry, Calvin was indeed expelled from Geneva. It turns out, being the fun police in a city that valued its festivities was as challenging as it sounds. But like any good sequel, Calvin's story in Geneva was far from over. During his exile, Calvin found himself in Strasbourg, a city more accommodating to his ideas, where he honed his theological arguments and penned significant works that would later influence Protestant thought. It was a bit like being sent to the minor leagues to work on your pitching before making a triumphant return to the majors. And return he did. By 1541, Geneva, having realized that perhaps a bit of structure wasn't such a bad thing after all, invited Calvin back to resume his work, albeit with slightly more respect for the importance of compromise. Calvin's second stint in Geneva was marked by a more tactful approach, though he remained unyielding in his vision of a morally upright society. The city was to be a new Jerusalem, a model of godly living that other Protestant cities could aspire to. Under Calvin's guidance, Geneva became a center of Protestant scholarship and debate, attracting thinkers and refugees from across Europe. It was an intellectual hub, a place where ideas could be exchanged freely, provided they fit within Calvin's framework of orthodoxy. Despite the immovable rules, Geneva's citizens found ways to work within and around the system. Calvin's persistence in pushing his moral agenda might have made him the ultimate party pooper, but it also laid the groundwork for a society that took pride in its order and discipline. The city's thriving economy during Calvin's time owed much to this newfound stability and the influx of skilled refugees who brought trade and commerce. Calvin's Geneva was a place of paradoxes, a city where conformity was enforced in the name of freedom, and where the path to salvation was paved with the cobblestones of austerity. In the end, Calvin's legacy in Geneva was a testament to the age-old struggle between individual liberty and collective responsibility. While some of his rules may seem draconian by today's standards, they reflected a genuine desire to create a community where everyone could flourish within the bounds of moral rectitude. Calvin was nothing if not consistent, a man whose relentless pursuit of his vision transformed Geneva from a city of spirited independence into a model of Reformation ideals. And so, as Calvin continued to shape Geneva, the city itself became a symbol of his enduring influence. His legacy, much like the Reformation itself, was a blend of idealism and pragmatism, a testament to the power of belief to shape societies for better or worse. With his reforms in full swing, Calvin's Geneva became a beacon for Protestants across Europe, a place where faith, order, and governance intertwined in a complex dance. A dance, it must be said, that was conducted with utmost decorum and no small amount of constraint. The tale of John Calvin and Geneva wasn't just a chapter in the history of the Reformation. It was a story of ambition, resilience, and the delicate art of balancing ideology with reality. And so, as Calvin continued to shape Geneva, the city itself became a symbol of his enduring influence. But let's switch gears and dive into the literary world of John Calvin, where he wielded a quill with the same authority he did in Geneva's austere streets. Enter Institutes of the Christian Religion, the 16th century equivalent of a New York Times bestseller. If only the Times had existed back then. Imagine knocking out a theological tome that would become the cornerstone of Protestant theology, all while dodging the plague and keeping an eye on the ever-watchful consistory. Calvin's Institutes first appeared in 1536, a mere 516 pages in its debut edition. And like any good blockbuster, it went through several sequels, expanding in size and complexity, much like the Fast and Furious franchise, but with fewer car chases and more predestination. By its final 1559 edition, it had ballooned to a doorstopper of over 500 pages. Calvin wasn't just writing a book, he was constructing a theological fortress. Now, let's talk logistics. How do you distribute a bestseller in the 1500 without the modern convenience of online shopping or even a reliable postal service? Enter the printing press, the social media of its day, allowing ideas to go viral faster than you can say Gutenberg. Thanks to this technological marvel, Calvin's Institutes spread like wildfire across Europe, a continent that was, quite frankly, already pretty flammable with the ongoing religious upheavals. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, was the disruptor of its age, turning book production from a monastic labor of love into something resembling mass production. Calvin's Institutes rolled off presses in cities like Geneva, Basel, and Strasbourg, places that were the Silicon Valleys of Reformation thought. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The Catholic Church wasn't exactly thrilled about Calvin's theological musings, which meant clandestine distribution was often the name of the game. Think of it as a kind of underground book club, but with higher stakes and less wine. But hold on, let's not get too carried away with this romantic notion of the rebellious reformer. The truth is, Calvin was as much a product of his time as he was a shaper of it. The Institutes wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a calculated move. By laying out a comprehensive theology, Calvin was positioning himself as a heavyweight in the Protestant movement. This wasn't just about faith, it was about influence. And influence, as any Instagrammer will tell you, can be more valuable than gold. In Institutes, Calvin tackled head-on the doctrines of justification, predestination, and the sacraments, among others. And let's be real, his penchant for theological jargon could make even the most dedicated reader's eyes glaze over. Terms like supralapsarianism and infralapsarianism sound more like spells from the Hogwarts curriculum than anything else. Yet amidst the labyrinth of dense rhetoric, the work resonated with those yearning for clarity amid the chaos of religious reform. Calvin's magnum opus was revered by many as a beacon of truth, but it didn't escape the ire of critics who found its tone, well, a tad authoritarian. Some might say Calvin had the bedside manner of a drill sergeant when it came to matters of doctrine. But hey, in an age of indulgent salesmen and religious wars, a bit of sternness wasn't entirely unwarranted. The economic context of the time played no small part in the book's reception. The printing revolution meant books were more affordable, but they still weren't exactly cheap. Owning a copy of Institutes was akin to having the latest tech gadget today, prestigious, and a sign of being in the know. Prices could vary, but you might be shelling out the equivalent of several days' wages for a single volume. Yet, for many, it was a price worth paying for a roadmap through the theological thicket. The 1500 were a time when the very concept of nation-states was still in its infancy, and religion often served as the glue that held communities together, or the wedge that drove them apart. Calvin's writings tapped into this landscape, providing a framework for governance that appealed to both spiritual and civic leaders eager for stability. In a world where monarchs and popes jostled for supremacy, Calvin's Institutes offered a blueprint for societies that aspired to order without the overarching authority of Rome. Calvin's influence wasn't limited to the pews and pulpits of Europe. His ideas rippled across the Atlantic, laying the groundwork for the Puritan ethos that would later shape the fledgling American colonies. In a way, Calvin was the original influencer, his doctrines spreading not through hashtags, but through the relentless power of the printed word. But let's not get too misty-eyed about Calvin's reach. The man was human, after all, and not immune to the criticisms of his contemporaries. Some accused him of being overly rigid, his theological system as unyielding as the stone facades of Geneva's churches. Yet, even as detractors scoffed at his dogged insistence on predestination, followers found comfort in the certainty his teachings promised. In a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed, thanks to war, disease, or famine, Calvin's doctrines offered a semblance of control over one's eternal fate. And just like that, Calvin managed to etch his name into the annals of history, not through conquest or royalty, but through the sheer force of his ideas. The Institutes was more than a book. It was a movement. It was the intellectual lifeblood of a burgeoning Protestant identity, a testament to the power of thought to reshape societies. Calvin might not have had the flash of Luther's 95 Theses or the drama of Henry Roman VIII break with Rome, but his work was no less groundbreaking. As we continue this journey through the life of John Calvin, remember that his story isn't a neat package tied with a bow. It's a tapestry, woven with threads of ambition, faith, and a healthy dose of controversy. The man who began his career dodging chamber pots in Paris had, by the time of his death in 1564, left an indelible mark on a world that was only beginning to understand the power of the printed word. So, what's next for our stern theologian? Stay tuned as we explore the latter chapters of Calvin's life, where his influence will reach new heights, and his legacy will become the bedrock for future generations seeking to navigate the turbulent waters of faith and reason. As the ink dried on Calvin's, institutes of the Christian religion. His influence extended beyond mere pages into the tangled world of theological debates and personal rivalries that defined the Protestant Reformation. And let's be clear, this wasn't your friendly neighborhood book club. It was more like a medieval Twitter war, where a disagreement wasn't settled with a mute button, but often with public denouncements, and if you were really unlucky, a pyre. Enter Sebastian Caselio, a name often glossed over in the highlight reel of Reformation history, but a thorn in Calvin's side nonetheless. Caselio was a Frenchman with his own set of ideas about religious tolerance, ideas that clashed with Calvin's stricter, more fire and brimstone approach. Caselio had the audacity to suggest that maybe, just maybe, heretics shouldn't be executed. Radical, right. In a time when burning someone at the stake was practically an after-school activity, Caselio's calls for tolerance were about as popular with Calvin as a snowstorm in July. Their rivalry came to a head over the infamous execution of Michael Servetus in 1553. Servetus was a Spanish physician, theologian, and amateur astronomer who had the misfortune of crossing paths with Calvin. Servetus's crime: denying the Trinity, which, in the theological world, was akin to showing up at a vegan potluck with a rack of ribs. He was caught in Geneva, and despite the fact that both Catholic and Protestant leaders wanted his head, it was Calvin who got the dubious honor of lighting the match. Servetus's execution was a public spectacle, a chilling reminder that Calvin's idea of tough love involved more kindling than kindness. Now, if you're thinking Calvin might have had a moment of moral reflection, think again. He viewed the execution as a necessary evil to preserve religious purity. In his mind, Geneva wasn't just a city, but a fortress of faith that needed defending at all costs. It's a bit like arguing that the best way to keep your house clean is to burn it down. Effective, sure, but not exactly the most nuanced approach. Caselio, horrified by the execution, penned a scathing critique titled, "Whether Heretics Should Be Persecuted," essentially arguing that killing people over theological differences was, to put it mildly, overkill. He famously quipped, "To kill a man is not to defend a doctrine, but to kill a man." His words struck a chord with those uneasy about the Reformation's darker undertones, but instead of sparking a large-scale reevaluation, Caselio's dissent was largely overshadowed by Calvin's towering influence. His ideas were more a whisper in the wind than a clarion call for change. Yet, it would be too simple to paint Calvin as a one-dimensional villain twirling his mustache. Man was complex, a product of his time and a shaper of it. His insistence on doctrinal purity, though severe, stemmed from a genuine belief in a unified, orderly society. He feared that religious dissent could unravel the social fabric, much like a loose thread on a sweater. And let's not forget, the 16th century was no walk in the park. It was a time when kings and popes were as likely to wage war over a theological dispute as they were over territory. In such a volatile world, Calvin's rigid stance offered a semblance of stability. Economically, Geneva thrived under Calvin's watchful eye. The influx of Protestant refugees, fleeing persecution from less tolerant corners of Europe, brought with them skills and trades that bolstered the city's economy. Silk weavers, bankers, and artisans found a haven in Geneva, turning it into a bustling hub of commerce and industry. It was a bit like Silicon Valley, but with fewer tech startups and more predestination. But what about Calvin's softer side, you ask? Well, it wasn't all fire and fury. Calvin was also a prolific correspondent, penning thousands of letters that reveal a more nuanced personality. His letters to fellow reformers and friends show a man capable of warmth, humor, and even doubt. He often wrote to his wife, Idlet, with affection, referring to her as his dearest companion. It seems that even theological titans need someone to share their triumphs and tribulations with. Calvin's relationships with other reformers were a mix of camaraderie and conflict. While he shared a mutual respect with figures like Martin Bucer and Heinrich Bullinger, his interactions with Luther were a different story. Calvin admired Luther, even sent him a copy of his Institutes as a gesture of respect. But Luther, being Luther, dismissed it with the kind of tact you'd expect from a bull in a china shop. Luther reportedly never read it, preferring to stick to his own theological guns. It's like sending your mixtape to a famous producer and getting radio silence in return. As the years went by, Calvin's health began to deteriorate, a reminder that even the most indomitable figures are, in the end, human. He suffered from migraines, lung problems, and gout, ailments that would have sidelined a lesser man. Yet, Calvin remained active in his duties, driven by a sense of purpose that transcended personal discomfort. Until his death in 1564, he continued to preach, write, and mentor the next generation of Protestant leaders. In the grand tapestry of history, Calvin's story is a reminder of the complexities of human nature. He was a visionary who dared to reimagine the future, but was also bound by the limitations of his era. His legacy is a paradox of order and rigidity, faith and doubt. And while his methods may have been harsh, his impact was undeniable, shaping not only Geneva, but the course of Western history. As we leave this chapter behind, remember that the Reformation was a time of contradictions, where the quest for truth often led to tumult and transformation. Calvin was a man of his age, with all the flaws and brilliance that entails. His story isn't one of simple heroics or villainy, but of a relentless pursuit of a vision that continues to echo through the ages. Stay tuned as we delve into the final act of Calvin's life, where his enduring influence will continue to unfold like a story that refuses to end. Calvin's legacy is a bit like the contents of a Renaissance era attic, full of treasures, dust, and the ard skeleton. As we close this chapter on John Calvin, it's time to unpack how his ideas managed to seep into the very fabric of Western civilization, transforming not just the religious landscape, but also economic and cultural domains in ways that even he might have found surprising. Now, if you've heard the phrase Calvinism and capitalism in the same breath, you're not alone. This dynamic duo has been the subject of much scholarly debate, thanks in no small part to sociologist Max Weber, who proposed that the Protestant work ethic, of which Calvinism is a poster child, laid the groundwork for capitalism. Weber argued that Calvinists, with their emphasis on hard work and frugality, inadvertently created a climate ripe for economic growth. Picture it, a bunch of pious Calvinists working their fingers to the bone, not for the love of money, heaven forbid, but as a sign of God's favor. Yet, let's not romanticize this as a rags-to-riches fairy tale. The reality was far more complex. Calvinism preached that material success might be a sign of divine election, but this wasn't exactly a free pass to indulge in luxury. Oh no, the Calvinist mindset was more about reinvesting those profits back into the community or business, a sort of divine piggy bank, if you will. This thriftiness, combined with a relentless work ethic, provided the perfect soil for capitalism to take root and flourish. Geneva, during Calvin's tenure, became a case study in this budding economic model. The city was a magnet for Protestant refugees who were often skilled artisans and merchants. This influx of talent and innovation sparked an economic boom, transforming Geneva into a hub of commerce. Banking, in particular, thrived, with Calvinist principles encouraging honesty and integrity in financial dealings. The city's prosperity, it turns out, was less about divine intervention and more about a pragmatic intersection of faith and finance. But wait, before we crown Calvin the unwitting godfather of capitalism, let's consider the full picture. It wasn't just Calvinism that fueled this economic revolution. The broader Protestant Reformation dismantled many of the old Catholic economic restrictions, such as bans on charging interest. This shift in economic policy was like removing a restrictive corset, allowing trade and commerce to breathe and expand. Calvinism's influence wasn't confined to Europe. Fast forward to the 17th century, and you'll find Calvinist ideals washing up on the shores of the New World. The Puritans, those famous Calvinist descendants, carried the torch of Calvin's teachings across the Atlantic, embedding them into the cultural DNA of what would eventually become the United States. The Puritan work ethic, rooted in Calvin's doctrines, emphasized discipline, thrift, and a sense of community, values that would shape the American ethos for centuries. In the realm of culture, Calvinism's reach extended into music, art, and education, albeit with a cautious, puritanical twist. While Lutheran Germany was busy composing hymns that could make the angels sing, Calvinist regions were more subdued, favoring psalm singing without instrumental accompaniment. It's like opting for an a cappella choir when everyone else is booking rock bands. Despite, or perhaps because of, this restraint, Calvinist communities cultivated a culture of literacy and learning. Calvin himself was a staunch advocate for education, believing it essential for understanding Scripture. His emphasis on schooling laid the groundwork for educational reforms that would ripple across Europe and beyond. Now, let's tackle the elephant in the room, the myth of Calvin as a dour, joyless figure. The truth, much like Calvin's theology, is in the nuance. While it's easy to caricature Calvin as the ultimate killjoy, banning dancing, colorful socks, and whatnot, there's more to the story. Calvin was a man deeply committed to his vision of a godly society, but he also understood the importance of community and compassion, advocating for social welfare programs and caring for the poor. Calvin's personal life offers more glimpses into his humanity. He was known to enjoy the company of friends and even the occasional joke, though likely of the dry variety. His correspondence reveals a man who could express warmth and affection, particularly in his letters to his wife, Idlet. It seems the stern theologian had a softer side, one that cherished companionship and valued family ties. Yet, it's undeniable that Calvin's legacy is tinged with the darker shades of religious intolerance, exemplified by the execution of Cerberus. This aspect of his life serves as a poignant reminder that even the most visionary leaders are susceptible to the limitations and prejudices of their time. It's a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of ideological purity can sometimes lead to moral compromise. As we wrap up this journey through Calvin's life, one can't help but wonder how he might react to his posthumous celebrity. Would he revel in it, or would he be appalled by the global reach of his teachings? It's tempting to imagine Calvin scrolling through modern-day discussions of his work, perhaps on a tablet, a bemused look on his face, as he reads about the unexpected marriage of Calvinism and capitalism. Would he nod in approval at the continued emphasis on education and community welfare, or would he grimace at the commercialization and consumerism that seem at odds with his teachings? In the grand tapestry of history, Calvin's legacy is a complex weave of faith, discipline, and unintended consequences. His contributions to religious and social reform have left an indelible mark on Western civilization, shaping everything from economic systems to cultural norms. Calvin's story is not just a chapter in the annals of the Reformation, but a testament to the enduring power of ideas to transcend time and place. So there you have it. John Calvin, the man who transformed Geneva and left a legacy that continues to resonate in ways he could never have imagined. His life and work remind us that history is often a dance of contradictions, where the pursuit of ideals can lead to both great achievements and sobering lessons. As we close the book on Calvin, let's carry forward the insights gleaned from his journey, remembering that even the most austere of doctrines can give rise to a world of possibilities. Marie Curie, born Maria Skłodowska, didn't exactly spring from the womb with a test tube in hand, but she might as well have. As the youngest of 5 children in Warsaw in 1867, her parents, Bronislawa and W. Ladislaw Skłodowski, probably never imagined their little Maria would grow up to become the mother of modern physics. But then again, who expects their child to juggle radioactive elements like they're going out of fashion? Her early years in Poland were a cocktail of intellectual potential and economic hardship, served on the rocks of Russian oppression. Life in Warsaw wasn't all Chopin and pierogi. Poland was under the iron grip of the Russian Empire, and institutions of higher learning were about as welcome as a snowstorm in May. The only universities were Russian-run, and not exactly rolling out the red carpet for Polish women. But Maria's family had a secret weapon, an unyielding belief in education. Her father, a mathematics and physics teacher, filled their heads with science and their shelves with books, probably risking a stern talking to from the authorities. Yet the family wasn't rolling in rubles. They faced financial struggles so tight they squeaked, which meant Maria had to rely more on brains than bucks. And brains she had. But she also had a problem. Those brains needed feeding, and there was a severe shortage of educational sustenance available to women in Warsaw. Enter the Flying University, a clandestine institution as exhilarating as it was illegal. Imagine Hogwarts, but with fewer wands and more textbooks hidden in coat linings. Here, Maria got her first taste of higher learning, her appetite for knowledge insatiable, and her textbooks, Well, borrowed. That's right, she had to rely on the kindness of others to get her hands on the necessary materials. It was like trying to study for finals with a library card that only worked on Tuesdays. The Flying University was a rebellious little operation, offering a curriculum that would make any czarist bureaucrat break out in hives. It wasn't just about dodging the authorities, it was about defying societal norms. Women, Polish women, no less, were being educated in secret learning subjects that were supposed to be beyond their delicate sensibilities. For Maria, it was a revelation. She wasn't just learning, she was fueling a fire that would one day illuminate the world. But before she could light up the scientific community, she had to cross the border. In 1891, Maria left Warsaw for Paris with a head full of dreams and a pocket that probably had more lint than francs. The move to Paris was like swapping a black and white film for Technicolor. The Sorbonne was calling, and she answered with the eagerness of a scientist, offered a mystery to solve. Yet life in Paris wasn't all croissants and cafes. Maria lived in a drafty attic, surviving on little more than bread and tea because money was tighter than a corset. Picture her in a room so cold, even the bedbugs wore scarves. But hey, who needs heat when you've got the warmth of academic pursuit? At the Sorbonne, she was one of 23 women among 825 students. Talk about being outnumbered. But Maria wasn't just a number. She was a force of nature, soaking up knowledge like a sponge dropped in a puddle. It's tempting to romanticize this period as a montage of gritty determination and inspiring lectures. But let's be real, it was tough. Maria faced discrimination and poverty, realities that could crush anyone's spirit. Yet she thrived, driven by a passion for science that defied the societal norms of her time. Her early years were a testament to her tenacity, a prelude to the groundbreaking achievements that would come. And as she sat in her chilly attic, poring over borrowed textbooks, she probably had no idea that she was laying the groundwork for a legacy that would outshine even the brightest radium glow. Little did Maria know, the warmth she craved in her Paris attic would come not from a heater, but from a fellow scientist with a passion for physics, and her. Enter Pierre Curie, a man with a mind as sharp as his facial hair was questionable. Now, we're not talking about your typical boy-meets-girl love story with moonlit dinners and roses. No, this was a meeting of minds in a lab filled with more chemicals than Cupid's arrows. Their courtship could be summed up as less romance, more radium. Pierre, a physicist whose interests ranged from magnetism to crystals, met Maria in 1894. It wasn't exactly love at first sight, but more like intellectual admiration at first hypothesis. He was captivated by her brilliance and determination to defy the odds stacked against women in science. She was impressed by his dedication and shared enthusiasm for research. It was a match made in scientific heaven, or at least in a laboratory that doubled as a love nest. Together, they were a dynamic duo, a powerhouse of intellect and curiosity. Think Batman and Robin, if Batman were obsessed with radioactive elements, and Robin had a penchant for physics equations. The Curies tied the knot in 1895, and their honeymoon was, unsurprisingly, a cycling trip through the French countryside. Romantic, right? Well, maybe not by conventional standards, but it was perfectly fitting for a couple who preferred the crunch of gravel beneath their wheels to the clink of champagne glasses. They settled into a life of scientific inquiry, which, despite its lack of traditional romance, was filled with mutual respect and shared ambition. Fast forward to 1898, when Marie made her groundbreaking contribution to science by coining the term radioactivity. It wasn't just a word, it was a concept that would change the world. While Marie was busy inventing scientific vocabulary, she and Pierre were also knee-deep in research that would lead to the discovery of two new elements, polonium and radium. Yes, folks, they were naming elements like people name their kids. Polonium was a nod to Marie's homeland, Poland, an act of patriotism wrapped in scientific achievement. Radium, on the other hand, was named for its radiant glow, which sounds beautiful until you realize it's the glow of radioactivity. Now, here's where the story takes a turn for the bizarre. The Curies, like many scientists of their time, had a rather cavalier approach to safety. Think of them as the evil Nevils of the lab world. They stored their radioactive materials in the most logical place, their kitchen. That's right, While most people kept flour and sugar, the Curies had radium and polonium. It wasn't just a kitchen, it was a radioactive playground. The glow of the materials was so mesmerizing that Marie would often carry test tubes of radium in her pockets, like some people carry snacks. This casual relationship with radioactivity wasn't just quirky, it was downright dangerous. But remember, this was a time when people thought radioactivity was the bee's knees. Products like radium-infused toothpaste and radioactive water were all the rage. People believed it had health benefits. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The Curies, however, weren't after commercial gain. They were driven by the pure pursuit of knowledge, even if it meant risking their health. Their research was grueling, involving the processing of tons of pitchblende, a uranium-rich mineral, to extract mere grams of radium. To put it in perspective, it was like mining for gold with a teaspoon. The process was labor-intensive and hazardous, but the Curies were undeterred. They were on a mission to uncover the secrets of the universe, and no amount of radioactive dust or sleepless nights would stop them. Marie and Pierre's partnership was a rare blend of personal and professional synergy. While their love story might lack the conventional flair of roses and serenades, it was a testament to the power of shared vision and mutual respect. They were collaborators in every sense, challenging each other intellectually and supporting each other's scientific endeavors. It was as if they were two halves of the same brain, working in harmony to push the boundaries of what was scientifically possible. It's easy to romanticize their story, to imagine them as a couple of eccentric geniuses tinkering away in a lab. But the reality was far more complex. They faced societal skepticism and financial challenges, often working in underfunded and under-equipped conditions. Yet they persevered, driven by a passion that transcended the limitations of their time. Their discoveries were not just scientific milestones, they were beacons of hope in a world that was still grappling with the mysteries of the atom. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Curies' work had laid the foundation for a new era in science. Their discoveries would go on to revolutionize medicine, physics, and chemistry. But at the time, they were simply two scientists with a shared dream and a kitchen full of radioactive materials. Their journey was far from over, and the legacy they were building was just beginning to take shape, glowing like the radium they so tirelessly pursued. As the Curies' kitchen continued to glow with the eerie light of radioactivity, their reputation in the scientific community was beginning to shine just as brightly. By 1903, Marie and Pierre Curie had become household names in the world of science, though probably not in the same households where people were still drinking radium water for its supposed health benefits. You know, like the way folks today swear by activated charcoal smoothies. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That same year, Marie Curie was on the cusp of receiving one of the highest honors in science, the Nobel Prize in Physics. Now, here's where the story takes a twist that even a soap opera writer might find a bit much. When the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences first considered the Curies for the prestigious award, Marie's name was conspicuously absent from the nomination list. Yes, you heard that right. Marie, who had co-discovered the phenomenon of radioactivity and co-named two elements, was initially overlooked. It was like giving a standing ovation to a two-person duet and only applauding the guy holding the mic. Thankfully, a Swedish mathematician by the name of Magnus Gosta-Middagleffler stepped in, ensuring that Marie was recognized as a co-recipient alongside Pierre and Henri Becquerel, the French physicist who had initially discovered uranium's radioactive properties. Receiving the Nobel Prize was a landmark moment, but it came with its own set of challenges. While the prize money, an eye-popping 70,000 francs, was no small potatoes at the time, it didn't exactly catapult the Curies into luxury. To put it in perspective, that amount roughly equates to about $400,000 today. Sure, not chump change, but not quite the jackpot it might seem, especially when you're trying to fund groundbreaking research that involves handling highly dangerous materials. Besides, a good chunk of their finances was perpetually tied up in their scientific endeavors. Imagine winning the lottery and realizing most of your winnings are going to pay for lab coats and Geiger counters. Despite the fame and the financial boost from the Nobel Prize, the Curies continued to face economic constraints. Their lab was still more of a glorified shed than a state-of-the-art facility. and they worked tirelessly to secure additional funding. Marie, in particular, was determined to turn radium into a legitimate industry. She wasn't just a scientist. She was an entrepreneur in the making, looking to bridge the gap between scientific discovery and practical application. But the path was anything but smooth. Enter the radium craze, an era when people seemed to think that radioactivity was the elixir of life. Products like radium-infused cosmetics, radium-laced chocolate, and even radium water were all the rage. You might say radium was the avocado toast of the early 1900s, except, slightly more hazardous to your health. The marketing pitch: radium was sold as a wonder cure, promising to invigorate the body and boost vitality. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But hey, in a world without Google, people were more inclined to trust the dubious claims of radium salesmen than to question the science. Marie, however, was less interested in the commercial frenzy and more focused on using radium for medical purposes. She envisioned a future where radioactivity could be harnessed to treat cancer, a radical idea at the time, but one that laid the groundwork for radiation therapy. She was driven by a desire to see her discoveries improve human life, even if it meant navigating the murky waters of patent laws and commercial exploitation. Despite the challenges, Marie Curie's determination was as unyielding as ever. She refused to patent her discoveries, believing that scientific knowledge should be freely shared for the greater good. It was a noble stance, but it also left her without the financial security that could have come from licensing her work. Imagine inventing the cure for a disease and then deciding that, you'd rather give it away for free. That's the kind of altruism that would make even Mother Teresa raise an eyebrow. Yet, even with these financial and logistical hurdles, Marie remained undeterred. She continued her research, often under less than ideal conditions. Her work was meticulous, labor-intensive, and required a level of precision that would make even the most detail-oriented person break into a sweat. But Marie was nothing if not relentless. She was on a mission to uncover the mysteries of radioactivity and its potential applications, and no amount of bureaucratic red tape or financial strain was going to stop her. As if the financial struggles and the radium craze weren't enough, Marie also had to contend with the societal challenges of being a woman in science. Despite her groundbreaking achievements, she was often viewed through the lens of her gender rather than her contributions. The very idea of a woman leading scientific research was as revolutionary as her discoveries themselves. It's the kind of irony that would make a stand-up comedian's head spin. And yet, through it all, Marie Curie remained a trailblazer, breaking barriers and redefining what was possible for women in science. Her journey was far from over, and the legacy she was building would continue to shine brightly, illuminating the path for future generations of scientists. Just as radium's glow could light up a dark room, Marie's brilliance would continue to light up the scientific world, long after the radium craze had fizzled out like a bad 1900s fad diet. Marie Curie's life had been a whirlwind of scientific breakthroughs and radioactive discoveries, but 1906 marked a year that would test her resilience like never before. Tragedy struck when Pierre Curie, her partner in both life and lab work, died in a freak accident. Picture this: a rain-slicked Paris street, a horse-drawn cart, and a collision that would leave Marie a widow and the scientific community reeling. It was the kind of event that feels more fitting in a dramatic novel than the annals of scientific history. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, doesn't it? For Marie, the loss was devastating. Pierre had been more than a husband. He was her intellectual equal, a partner in every sense of the word. Their shared passion for science had been the glue that held their lives together. Now, she found herself alone, staring at a future that seemed as uncertain as the properties of radioactivity itself. Yet, in classic Curie fashion, Marie didn't let grief consume her. Instead, she channeled her sorrow into her work. It was as if the glow of radium, which had once illuminated their kitchen, now fueled her determination to carry on Pierre's legacy. And carry on she did, with a tenacity that would make even the most stubborn mule look like a pushover. In 1906, just months after Pierre's untimely death, the Sorbonne offered Marie his professorship, a gesture that was both a tribute to Pierre's legacy and a recognition of Marie's own scientific prowess. But let's not sugarcoat it. Marie was stepping into uncharted territory. She was about to become the first woman to teach at the Sorbonne, a milestone that was both groundbreaking and, frankly, overdue. Could almost hear the sound of monocles popping out of the eyes of the academic elite across Europe. Teaching at the Sorbonne wasn't just a job, it was a statement. Marie was breaking barriers at a time when women in academia were about as common as unicorns at a dog show. She wasn't just challenging the status quo, she was rewriting it. And while the students might have been there for a physics lesson, what they got was a masterclass in resilience and determination. Of course, Marie's journey wasn't without its bumps and bruises. The scientific community is notorious for its skepticism, and some of her colleagues viewed her not as a trailblazer, but as an anomaly. Yet, Marie had little time to worry about naysayers. She was busy navigating the labyrinth of research, balancing her roles as a mother and a scientist, all while dodging the radioactive debris of her past. As if teaching and raising 2 daughters weren't enough on her plate, Marie continued her research with the same vigor that had characterized her work with Pierre. By 1911, she was on the brink of yet another monumental achievement, a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry. The prize was awarded for her discovery of radium and polonium, and it made her the first person ever to win 2 Nobels in different scientific fields. But hold your applause, because Marie's second Nobel Prize came wrapped in enough controversy to fill a tabloid. You see, around the same time, Marie found herself embroiled in a scandal that would make even the most seasoned gossip columnist blush. Enter Paul Langevin, a physicist who was both a colleague and a fellow pioneer in the study of magnetism. He was also, inconveniently, a married man. Their affair became the stuff of front-page news, public scandal that threatened to overshadow Marie's scientific accomplishments. The tabloids had a field day, painting Marie as a homewrecker and a threat to the institution of marriage. It was a narrative that played into every stereotype about women in power, and it was as predictable as it was infuriating. But let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Here was a woman who had shattered glass ceilings and redefined what was possible in the world of science. Yet, the headlines seemed more interested in her personal life than her groundbreaking research. It was a stark reminder of the societal double standards that plagued women of her era, and let's be honest, continue to rear their ugly heads today. The scandal, however, didn't stop Marie from accepting her Nobel Prize. She attended the ceremony in Stockholm, refusing to let the wagging tongues of the press detract from her achievements. As she stood on that stage, she wasn't just accepting a medal. She was making a statement about the enduring power of scientific discovery, regardless of the personal storms that might rage around it. Despite the drama and the scrutiny, Marie Curie's legacy continued to grow. Her work laid the groundwork for advances in medicine and physics that would benefit generations to come. And while the tabloids eventually moved on to the next juicy story, Marie remained steadfast in her commitment to science. So, what can we learn from Marie's journey? Perhaps it's this. Resilience isn't just about weathering the storm. It's about using the storm's energy to propel you forward. Marie Curie did just that, turning personal tragedy and public scandal into fuel for her relentless pursuit of knowledge. Her life was a testament to the power of perseverance and the indomitable human spirit, a lesson that, much like the radioactive material she studied, continues to resonate long after the initial discovery. As we leave Marie at this pivotal moment, it's clear that her journey is far from over. With each challenge she faced, she peeled back another layer of the scientific world's mysteries, revealing truths that would light the way for future generations. Her story is one of both legend and reality, a tale as luminous as the radium she so passionately pursued. And as we prepare to delve deeper into the final chapter of her life, one thing is certain. Marie Curie's legacy will continue to shine, undimmed by time or scandal. As we journey into the final chapter of Marie Curie's illustrious life, it's clear that her story is one of both brilliance and resilience. Following the scandalous headlines and Nobel accolades, Marie didn't retreat into the shadows. Instead, she stepped into the glaring light of wartime necessity during World War I, proving once again that her legacy would be one of action, not just accolades. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Marie Curie could have easily remained ensconced in the academic ivory tower. Instead, she took to the battlefields, not with a rifle, but with X-rays. Recognizing the potential of radiography to transform battlefield medicine, Marie spearheaded the development of mobile radiography units. These weren't your run-of-the-mill X-ray machines, mind you. Dubbed Pettite's Curries, after their visionary creator, these units were essentially X-ray machines on wheels, making them the forerunners of the modern medical imaging equipment we take for granted today. By 1914, Marie had trained over 150 radiologists and equipped 20 vehicles with X-ray machines, all while navigating a landscape of logistical nightmares that would make any military strategist sweat bullets. Imagine trying to coordinate the movement of delicate equipment across a war-torn country. It was like trying to deliver a souffle through a hurricane. But Marie, undeterred by the challenges, ensured that soldiers received the medical attention they desperately needed. Talk about taking the Hippocratic Oath to the trenches. Marie wasn't just a lab-dwelling genius. She was a hands-on humanitarian. She personally drove one of these mobile units to the front lines, a feat that earned her a reputation as a fearless advocate for science in service of humanity. And let's not forget, she did all this in a world where women weren't exactly encouraged to take the wheel, literally or metaphorically. Marie's wartime efforts saved countless lives, providing a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest innovations are born out of necessity, not luxury. After the war, Marie returned to her scientific pursuits with the same vigor that had driven her to the front lines. In 1919, she founded the Radium Institute in Paris, a research facility dedicated to the study of radioactivity. The institute was a testament to Marie's vision for the future of science, a place where research and education went hand in hand. It was here that she hoped to cultivate a new generation of scientists, free from the constraints and prejudices that had marked her own journey. Under Marie's leadership, the Radium Institute became a hub of innovation, attracting some of the brightest minds of the era. And while the research conducted there would lead to significant advances in both physics and medicine, it also underscored the irony of Marie's contributions. Here she was, a woman who had unlocked the secrets of the atom, building an institution that would continue her work long after she was gone. Yet, the very society that benefited from her discoveries was still grappling with the idea of women in science. It's like inventing the light bulb and still having to convince people that electricity isn't just a passing fad. As we reflect on Marie Curie's legacy, it's easy to get swept up in the romanticism of her story. The brilliant scientist who defied the odds, the passionate advocate for education, the mother of modern physics. But let's not forget the harsh realities she faced, realities that included financial struggles, societal skepticism, and the physical toll of her work. By the time of her death in 1934, Marie had succumbed to aplastic anemia, a condition likely caused by her prolonged exposure to radiation. It's a cruel twist of fate that the very elements that illuminated her career would ultimately dim her life. Yet, even in death, Marie Curie's influence continues to resonate. Her work laid the groundwork for the development of radiation therapy, a cornerstone of modern medicine. Her commitment to education and scientific inquiry inspired generations of scientists, many of whom would go on to make groundbreaking discoveries of their own. Her story is a reminder that true legacy isn't defined by accolades or awards, but by the impact of one's work on the world. So, what can we take away from Marie Curie's life? Perhaps it's the notion that science, much like history, is a tapestry woven from both triumph and tragedy. It's a field where the pursuit of knowledge often requires navigating a labyrinth of challenges, both personal and professional. Marie Curie's journey was one of perseverance, marked by an unwavering commitment to truth and discovery. Her legacy is not just a testament to her brilliance, but a call to action, a reminder that the pursuit of science is a journey worth taking, no matter the obstacles. As we close the book on Marie Curie's story, it's clear that her life was one of profound significance, both inspiring and sobering in equal measure. She was a woman who dared to challenge the status quo, who pushed the boundaries of what was possible, and who left an indelible mark on the world of science. Her journey was complex, filled with moments of both light and shadow, but ultimately it was a story of enduring impact, a legacy that continues to shine, as luminous and transformative as the radium that defined her life's work. In the year 742, a baby boy was born in the region we now know as Belgium, and this kid would grow up to be a big deal, like Father of Europe, big. But before he got there, Charles, later known as Charlemagne, was just another royal kid with a name that sounded like a sneeze. His world was a chaotic mashup of power grabs, family feuds, and the kind of medieval drama that makes modern soap operas look like polite tea parties. Now, forget any romantic notions of medieval Europe being a place of chivalry and courtly love. Charlemagne's early years were set in a time when you were as likely to find a sword at the dinner table as you were a spoon. 8th century Europe was a place where leaders were expected to be both diplomats and warriors, sometimes simultaneously. It's like trying to be a CEO and a heavyweight champion at the same time. Talk about multitasking. Let's talk family, because Charlemagne's was the kind that made Thanksgiving awkward. His dad, Pepin the Short, yes, that's his real name, and yes, it's as unfortunate as it sounds, was the first king of the Franks, a title he snagged in 751. But before Pepin could flex his royal muscles, he had to deal with his own daddy issues. Charles Martel, Pepin's father, was the guy who stopped the Muslim expansion into Europe at the Battle of Tours in 732. Quite a legacy to live up to, right? So, Charlemagne was born into a family where the stakes were high and the expectations even higher. He had to navigate a realm where alliances were as stable as a house of cards in a tornado. His mother, Bertrade of Laon, was a savvy political player herself, but even she couldn't stop the family's internal squabbling. Charles had a brother, Charlemagne, whose name sounds like someone's lazy attempt at a superhero alias. The two brothers were supposed to share power after Pepin's death in 768, which was kind of like asking two toddlers to share a toy. Inevitably, it led to conflict. Charlemagne and Charlemagne's relationship was less buddy-buddy and more like a medieval version of sibling rivalry, with real swords instead of Nerf ones. When Pepin died, the Frankish kingdom was split between them, but cooperation was not in the cards. Charlemagne, who probably spent a lot of time glaring at Charlemagne over his goblet of ale, died suddenly in 771. The cause of his death is a mystery, but it conveniently left Charlemagne as the sole ruler. Coincidence? History isn't saying. Charlemagne's rise to power wasn't just about family drama and the occasional mysterious death. It was also about understanding the messy, violent world he lived in. Europe was like a giant chessboard, and Charlemagne was one of the few who knew how to play the game. He inherited a kingdom that was part of the Carolingian Empire, a place where borders were as fluid as the River Rhine. The Franks were in charge, but they were constantly fending off threats from all sides, the Saxons to the north, the Moors in Spain, and let's not forget the Lombards in Italy. Navigating this geopolitical mess required more than brute strength. It demanded a sharp mind and a talent for diplomacy. Charlemagne excelled at both. He wasn't just a warrior king, he was a strategist who knew when to swing his sword and when to extend his hand in friendship. It's like he had a medieval version of Google Maps, only instead of traffic updates, it warned him about potential invasions. But let's not paint Charlemagne as some medieval saint. He was as ruthless as he was clever. He wasn't above using religion as a tool for control, a practice that was kind of like having a holy trump card up his sleeve. He aligned himself closely with the Pope, which was a savvy move, considering the Church had a finger in nearly every pie in Europe. In 800, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo Roman III, a clever rebranding that made him sound like a big deal, even if the Roman Empire part was more aspirational than literal. So here we have Charlemagne, a man who could charm a bishop 1 minute and lead a cavalry charge the next. He was a ruler who understood the power of image and wasn't above using it to his advantage. His early life was a series of lessons in power dynamics, family politics, and the art of survival in a world where the line between ally and enemy was as clear as mud. And yet, through this chaotic tapestry of medieval madness, Charlemagne emerged as a leader who would shape the future of Europe, proving that sometimes the most unlikely people can leave the biggest marks. Charlemagne's meteoric rise wasn't just about surviving the medieval version of Game of Thrones. It was also about picking up a sword and getting down to business. Speaking of which, let's dive into one of the most grueling chapters of his reign, his 30-year tango with the Saxons. Yeah, 3 decades of warfare with a people who were as stubborn as a mule and about as interested in converting to Christianity as a cat is in taking a bath. The Saxon Wars kicked off in 772, and let's just say it was less of a skirmish and more of an epic saga. Charlemagne's goal was simple: unite the Saxons under his rule and convert them to Christianity. But this wasn't a quick campaign. It was a long, grinding conflict that made the 100 Years' War look like a weekend getaway. For Charlemagne, it was about power and faith, 2 things he held as tightly as a knight grips his lance. Now, the logistics of medieval warfare would make a modern military strategist break out in hives. Imagine trying to coordinate thousands of troops without email, GPS, or even reliable maps. Horses were your Humvees, and they required as much maintenance as a luxury car. Feeding an army wasn't just a matter of opening a few MREs. It involved massive supply chains, where grain and livestock had to be sourced, transported, and protected. The economic implications were staggering, with entire regions tasked with supporting these prolonged campaigns, often leading to shortages and economic strain. But the Saxons weren't just sitting ducks. They were fierce, resourceful, and knew their lands better than any Frankish invader. The Saxon leader, Widukind, was a particularly thorny opponent. Think of him as the medieval version of a guerrilla warfare expert, always slipping through Charlemagne's fingers like sand. Widukind's knack for evasion and rallying his people was legendary, and it's no wonder the Saxons saw him as a hero, while Charlemagne viewed him as a persistent headache. Despite the romanticized image of Charlemagne as a benevolent conqueror, the reality was much more brutal. His tactics were often ruthless, including the infamous massacre of Verdun in 782, where over 500 Saxon prisoners were executed. So much for the benevolent image. Charlemagne wasn't above using a heavy hand to get his point across. The message was clear: resist and face the consequences. Not quite the stuff of fairy tales, is it? The economic toll on the Frankish kingdom was immense. War wasn't cheap, and Charlemagne's campaigns were no exception. Funding these military endeavors required resources that came at the expense of the local populations. Taxes were levied, lands were seized, and the economy was stretched thin, like a medieval version of living paycheck to paycheck. But for Charlemagne, the prize was worth the price: control of northern Europe and the spread of Christianity. Charlemagne's efforts to convert the Saxons weren't just about religion, they were about solidifying his power. Aligning with the church gave him a divine mandate, making his rule seem not just legitimate, but ordained. It's like having the ultimate PR firm on your side, one that could sway the hearts and minds of even the most skeptical subjects. Yet, despite the hardships and the bloodshed, there was a method to the madness. Charlemagne's campaigns helped to create a more unified Europe, a legacy that would echo through the centuries. His ability to build alliances and integrate disparate regions into his empire was nothing short of remarkable. He wasn't just swinging a sword, he was laying the groundwork for a new political order. So, while the legend of Charlemagne often paints him as a noble knight on a holy quest, the reality was far grittier. It was a world where power was won through force, and faith was often a tool for political gain. And yet, through this blend of ambition and pragmatism, Charlemagne left an indelible mark on history, proving that even the most complex figures can shape the future in ways both profound and paradoxical. As we delve deeper into his story, remember that behind every legend lies a tapestry of triumphs and trials, woven together by the hands of history itself. Charlemagne's story, like a TV series with a surprise twist every season, takes us to Christmas Day in 800. This wasn't just any holiday celebration with mulled wine and medieval carols. Nope, it was the day Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by none other than Pope Leo Roman III. If your mental image involves a solemn ceremony with angelic choirs, hold that thought. It was more like a stage-managed spectacle, filled with political intrigue that would make Machiavelli proud. First, let's set the scene. Europe was a patchwork quilt of territories, sewn together with fragile alliances and stitched up with a whole lot of ambition. The Roman Empire was technically a relic of the past, more of an idea than a reality, but that didn't stop Charlemagne from wanting to revive it, or at least the parts that suited him. The coronation was less about restoring Rome and more about Charlemagne becoming the heavyweight champion of Western Europe. Imagine a title fight where the belt is a crown and the referee is the Pope. The backstory here is a mix of opportunism and necessity. Pope Leo Roman III had his own problems. Think of them as papal-sized headaches. He'd been attacked and then imprisoned by some rather unfriendly Romans who accused him of all sorts of unsaintly behavior. It was Charlemagne who came to his rescue, like a knight in shining armor with a political agenda tucked under his breastplate. In return, the Pope gave Charlemagne something even better than a get-out-of-jail-free card. He crowned him emperor, simultaneously thanking his rescuer and securing a powerful protector. Now, here's where the myth meets the messy reality. The coronation wasn't just a spontaneous act of divine inspiration. It was a shrewd political chess move. By crowning Charlemagne, Pope Leo Roman III was doing a little historical rebranding, effectively saying, "Hey, remember the Roman Empire? Let's reboot it." This wasn't just a power upgrade for Charlemagne. It was a strategic gambit for Leo, who was keen to strengthen the papacy's influence by hitching his wagon to the Frankish star. But let's not pretend Charlemagne's empire was a seamless, well-oiled machine. In truth, it was held together with the medieval equivalent of duct tape and fervent prayers. The lands he controlled were as diverse as they were vast, stretching from modern-day France and Germany to parts of Italy and beyond. This wasn't a cozy little kingdom. It was more like a sprawling jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces and mismatched borders. Managing such a domain required not just brute force, but also the financial savvy of a Wall Street wizard and the diplomatic charm of a seasoned negotiator. Speaking of finances, maintaining an empire wasn't cheap. Charlemagne's ambitions were funded by a complex system of taxes that would make today's IRS blush. The empire's economy was driven by agriculture, with peasants toiling away in fields to produce the grain and livestock that kept everyone fed. Taxes were levied on everything from land to trade, and while this helped fill the royal coffers, it also strained the very fabric of society. Imagine trying to balance a budget with one foot in a muddy field and the other in a lavish court. Despite the romantic image of a united empire, Charlemagne's realm was more like a patchwork quilt than a seamless tapestry. Each region had its own customs, laws, and languages, making governance a Herculean task. To keep the peace and ensure loyalty, Charlemagne relied on a network of counts and local officials who acted as his eyes and ears. These guys were the original middle managers, tasked with collecting taxes, administering justice, and occasionally putting out the fires of rebellion. Charlemagne's coronation also had broader implications for Europe's political landscape. It signaled a shift in power from the Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, to the newly minted Holy Roman Empire in the West. This wasn't just a geographical power play, it was a cultural one as well. The coronation was a nod to the idea that Western Europe was carving out its own identity, distinct from its Eastern counterpart. It's like Europe was saying, we can do this empire thing too, and we'll do it our way. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't some utopian vision of unity and prosperity. The reality was a constant balancing act, with Charlemagne as the ringmaster of a very unruly circus. His empire was a mosaic of territories, each with its own interests and agendas. It was a world where loyalty was often bought, not earned, and where the line between ally and enemy was as thin as parchment. Yet, through this chaotic dance, Charlemagne managed to lay the groundwork for what would become modern Europe. His efforts at centralizing power and standardizing practices, from coinage to education, nothing short of revolutionary. Sure, it was a bumpy ride, with plenty of detours and dead ends, but it was a journey that would shape the continent for centuries to come. As Charlemagne's story unfolds, it becomes clear that his legacy is a complex tapestry of triumphs and tribulations. He was a ruler who understood the power of image and wasn't afraid to wield it like a sword. His coronation as emperor was more than just a ceremony. It was a declaration of intent, a bold statement that Europe was ready for a new chapter. And while the legend of Charlemagne often paints him as a noble knight on a holy quest, the reality was far grittier, a testament to the fact that even the most storied figures have feet of clay. So, as we continue to unravel the threads of Charlemagne's reign, remember that behind every great leader lies a tangled web of ambition, strategy, and the occasional backroom deal. The coronation of 800 was just one moment in a much larger saga, a tale of power and politics that would reverberate through the annals of history. Stay tuned, because the story of Charlemagne is far from over, and the next chapters promise even more intrigue, innovation, and the kind of medieval drama that would give any modern soap opera a run for its money. And so, with the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor freshly perched on his brow, Charlemagne wasn't just content with flexing his political muscles across Europe. No, he had bigger fish to fry, not just keeping his empire in check, but also sparking a cultural and educational revival in a time when literacy was about as common as a unicorn sighting. Welcome to the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of intellectual awakening that made medieval Europe a little less dark and a bit more enlightened. Now, if you're picturing Charlemagne as some toga-wearing philosopher king lounging in a scriptorium, let's pump the brakes on that chariot of romantic imagery. Charlemagne was more of a practical ruler than a starry-eyed visionary. He wasn't penning sonnets in his spare time. He was focused on keeping his sprawling empire's lights on and its machinery humming. But he did have a knack for spotting talent, like the medieval version of a talent scout, and he knew how to leverage it. Enter Alcuin of York, the intellectual heavyweight who became Charlemagne's right-hand man in the quest for educational reform. Alcuin was the kind of guy who'd ace every trivia night, an Anglo-Saxon scholar from Northumbria who could debate theology before breakfast and toss in a bit of astronomy for dessert. He was invited to Charlemagne's court around 782, and it didn't take long for him to become the mastermind behind the emperor's cultural endeavors. Think of Alcuin as the brains behind Charlemagne's operation, a medieval Steve Jobs, but instead of the latest gadget, he was rolling out a curriculum that would put the Frankish kids in the fast lane. Under Alcuin's influence, Charlemagne established the palace school at Aachen, which became the intellectual hub of the Carolingian Empire. This wasn't just some elite prep school for the emperor's inner circle. It was a place where the curriculum was as rigorous as it was diverse. They weren't just reading Bible verses and practicing their Latin conjugations. They were diving into the liberal arts, the trivium and quadrivium, to be precise. That's grammar, rhetoric, and logic for the former, and arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy for the latter. It was like a medieval version of AP classes, designed to produce well-rounded thinkers who could navigate the complexities of an empire. But why all this focus on education? Well, Charlemagne wasn't just a ruler. He was a strategist who understood the power of a literate administration. In a world where most folks couldn't tell enough from a plowshare, having a cadre of educated officials was like having the ultimate cheat code to governance. It meant better record-keeping, more effective communication, and a bureaucracy that didn't operate at the speed of sludge. Charlemagne's educational reforms extended beyond the walls of Aachen. He issued decrees, known as capitularies, that mandated the establishment of schools in every monastery and cathedral across his empire. These weren't just lofty ideals written on parchment. They were practical measures to ensure that the clergy, who were often the empire's administrators, could read, write, and count. It's like he was saying, if you're going to run my empire, at least know how to do your sums. Now, here's where we bust a myth or two. The Carolingian Renaissance wasn't some spontaneous flowering of culture and knowledge a la the Italian Renaissance. It was a calculated effort to revive and preserve classical learning, driven by necessity rather than pure intellectual curiosity. Charlemagne wasn't trying to create a utopia of scholars. He was building an infrastructure that would keep his empire stable and efficient. And yet, despite the practical motivations, the impact was profound. This wasn't just about training the bureaucrats of tomorrow. It was a cultural awakening that encouraged the copying of classical texts, saving many works from oblivion. Monks became the human photocopiers of the medieval world, painstakingly transcribing ancient manuscripts in the dim glow of candlelight. Thanks to these efforts, texts by authors like Virgil, Cicero, and Boethius survived to inform future generations. But let's not sugarcoat it. This intellectual boom was happening in a time when most folks were more acquainted with the plow than the pen. Literacy rates were low, with estimates suggesting that only about 1-2% of the population could read or write. The Carolingian Renaissance was, therefore, an elite affair, impacting the upper echelons of society far more than the average peasant toiling in the fields. That said, the ripple effects were significant. The creation of Carolingian minuscule, a more legible script, revolutionized the way texts were written, making them easier to read and reproduce. It was like upgrading from hieroglyphics to Helvetica, facilitating the spread of knowledge and laying the groundwork for future cultural advancements. So, was Charlemagne an enlightened ruler, a beacon of cultural revival in a world of swords and sandals? Or was he simply a pragmatic king, ensuring his empire ran as smoothly as possible? The reality is probably somewhere in between. His reign was characterized by a blend of idealism and practicality, of cultural patronage and political strategy. He may not have been a philosopher king, but he understood the value of education as a tool for empire building. As we wrap up this chapter of Charlemagne's saga, it's clear that his contributions to education and culture were as instrumental as his military conquests in shaping the future of Europe. But remember, this is just one slice of the Charlemagne pie. There's more to come, and the story of how this medieval powerhouse left his mark on history is far from finished. So stay tuned, because the next installment promises even more twists, turns, and a few surprises that might just make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the father of Europe. And so, as Charlemagne rode the wave of his educational reforms, he also rode headlong into the twilight of his reign. Fast forward to January 28, 814, when the man who had spent his life weaving the tapestry of Europe breathed his last. Death caught up with him in Aachen, the city he had elevated to the nerve center of his empire. Charlemagne was, by medieval standards, ancient at the age of 71, an age when most folks were lucky to still have their original teeth. With Charlemagne's passing, the empire that had once sprawled like an overgrown lawn across Western Europe faced a crossroads. His deathbed wasn't just the end of a life, it was the prelude to a grand unraveling. You see, Charlemagne's empire was less a monolithic entity and more a collection of territories held together by the force of his personality and the sharpness of his sword. The glue wasn't so much super strength as it was medieval spit and prayers. The empire was divided among his grandsons with the Treaty of Verdun in 843, less than 30 years after his death. This split was like handing out slices of a pie that everyone had been eyeing hungrily. The empire was carved into 3 distinct parts: West Francia, East Francia, and Middle Francia. To put it in relatable terms, imagine divvying up a kingdom-sized pizza where everyone wants the cheesy center, but someone's going to end up with the crust. This division was both a pragmatic necessity and a ticking time bomb. Charlemagne's empire had been a sprawling, diverse patchwork of cultures and languages. Trying to keep it united under a single ruler would have been like herding cats, a task requiring patience, cunning, and probably a few scratches along the way. The split made sense, but it also laid the groundwork for future conflicts, as these new kingdoms bickered like siblings over their inheritance. The split was a classic case of good intentions meeting harsh realities. The idea was to ensure peace by giving each heir a slice of power, but it led to centuries of warfare, the medieval equivalent of a family feud that just wouldn't quit. The once mighty empire devolved into a collection of territories that would eventually form the basis of modern European states. West Francia morphed into what we now know as France, East Francia evolved into Germany, and Middle Francia, well, it was history's equivalent of a short-lived band that never quite found its groove. Here's where the myth of Charlemagne as the father of Europe starts to get a little frayed around the edges. Sure, he laid the groundwork for future nations, but the disintegration of his empire highlights the impermanence of even the grandest achievements. His legacy was both a blueprint for unity and a cautionary tale about the fragility of power. Charlemagne's empire was, in many ways, a house of cards built on a foundation of ambition and shared faith. Take away the unifying force of his leadership, and the whole thing was bound to come tumbling down. But let's not get too cynical. Charlemagne's impact on Europe was undeniable. He may not have created the perfect empire, but he did plant the seeds for the political and cultural landscape of the continent. His alliance with the Church bolstered the papacy's influence, setting the stage for the tangled dance between secular and ecclesiastical powers that would define European history for centuries. It's like he left behind a playbook that every aspiring empire builder would flip through, trying to figure out the right moves. Now, let's address why Charlemagne's story still captivates us. What is it about this medieval powerhouse that keeps historians and history buffs alike coming back for more? Part of it is the sheer scope of his achievements. He was a warrior, a reformer, a king who managed to stitch together a patchwork of feuding territories into something resembling a coherent empire. The romantic image of a noble king striving to create unity in a fragmented world appeals to our sense of nostalgia for a time when heroism seemed more straightforward. But the reality, as always, is a bit more complex. Charlemagne was as much a pragmatist as he was a visionary. His story is a testament to the messy, often brutal nature of politics and power. His legacy is a reminder that even the most storied figures are human, with all the contradictions and complexities that entails. He was a ruler who used faith as a tool, who wielded power with both wisdom and severity, and who left behind an empire that was as fragmented as it was influential. In a way, Charlemagne's life and legacy offer lessons that are as relevant today as they were in the 9th century. The idea that unity requires both strength and diplomacy, that cultural and educational advancements can underpin political stability, and that leadership is as much about vision as it is about shrewd decision-making. These are timeless truths. His story encourages us to look beyond the myths and see the reality of leadership, with all its triumphs and tribulations. So, as we close the book on Charlemagne, let's remember him as a figure who straddled the line between legend and reality. He wasn't just the father of Europe. He was a man who understood the power of dreams and the necessity of strategy. His empire may have crumbled, but the echoes of his reign continue to shape the world we live in today. And maybe that's the real legacy of Charlemagne, a reminder that history is a living, breathing tapestry woven from the actions of those who dared to dream big, even when reality proved to be a tougher adversary than any Saxon warrior. In the bustling heart of the Byzantine Empire, where the air smelled of ambition and incense, young Theodora was something of an anomaly, and not just because her father was a bear trainer. That's right, folks. While your dad might have been an accountant or a teacher, Theodora's was wrangling bears at the hippodrome. Talk about an unusual take-your-daughter-to-work day. Theodora, born around 500 AD, had a childhood that was anything but typical. With a bear trainer father and a dancer mother, her early life was more circus than civics. The hippodrome was the epicenter of entertainment and political intrigue in Constantinople, a place where chariots raced and allegiances were won or lost with a wink and a nod. Here, in this swirling mix of chaos and culture, Theodora learned to navigate a world where spectacle was as important as substance. Now, when we talk about Theodora's youth, it's essential to address the elephant, or should I say, bear in the room. Her father, Acacius, was part of the Greens, one of the Hippodrome's famed chariot teams, which were basically the ancient world's sports franchises. Think of them as the Byzantine Yankees, only with more political assassinations. When Acacius died, Theodora's family fell on hard times, and her mother did what any pragmatic Byzantine matriarch would do. She put her daughters on stage. Theodora entered the theatrical world, which was less about Broadway and more about bawdy. The roles she played were often risque, even by today's standards. One famous act involved her imitating Leda and the swan, using a little grain to entice some genuinely confused geese. It's a performance that wouldn't have looked out of place at a particularly avant-garde modern art festival. But let's not kid ourselves. This was more than just entertainment. This was survival. In a society where women were often seen as little more than decorative pawns, Theodora used the stage as her first real platform. She was sharp, witty, and knew how to command a room, skills that would serve her well in the snake pit of Byzantine politics. And let's be honest, if you can dodge a charging goose, you can probably handle a room full of scheming courtiers. So how did the daughter of a bear trainer and a stage performer rise to become one of the most powerful women in Byzantine history? Well, it involved more than a little ingenuity and a keen understanding of the social ladder, or rather, how to leap over it entirely. Theodora wasn't content with just playing the roles assigned to her by society. She was rewriting the script. Her first big break came when she caught the eye of a high-ranking official named Justinian. Rumor has it, their meeting was less a tete-a-tete and more a battle of wits. with Theodora clearly coming out on top. Despite the fact that marrying an actress was practically unheard of for someone like Justinian, he was smitten. Call it love, call it a strategic alliance. It was probably a bit of both. Justinian was no ordinary suitor. He was a rising star in the Byzantine political firmament, nephew to the Emperor Justin I, and had a mind as sharp as a Byzantine dagger. Their relationship was a turning point, not just for Theodora, but for the empire itself. With Justinian, Theodora found not just a partner, but a co-conspirator, someone who saw her potential beyond the roles she'd been forced to play. But let's not romanticize it too much. Their union was as much about power as it was about passion. Justinian and Theodora were a formidable team, combining their talents to maneuver through the Byzantine bureaucracy with the finesse of a chess grandmaster. Or, given their penchant for intrigue, maybe more like a poker player with a hidden ace. It's crucial to understand that Theodora's ascent was not just some fairy tale rise to power. It was a calculated climb, with every step meticulously planned and executed. She had to contend with the Byzantine elite, who viewed her with suspicion and disdain. An actress as Empress was practically heretical, yet Theodora didn't just survive in this hostile environment, she thrived. As Empress, Theodora transformed into a political powerhouse. She wielded influence with the precision of a surgeon, advocating for women's rights and social reforms that were centuries ahead of their time. She pushed for laws that expanded the rights of women in divorce, property ownership, and even protection from domestic violence. Not exactly what you'd expect from someone with a background in vaudeville, right? Yet, her past was never far behind her. The Byzantine court was a hotbed of gossip, and Theodora's origins were often used as ammunition by her detractors. But here's the kicker: she embraced it. Rather than hide from her past, she used it as proof of her resilience and capability. After all, if she could survive the wilds of the Hippodrome, she could handle a few snide comments from the peanut gallery. Theodora's life is a testament to the art of reinvention. She didn't just play the game, she changed the rules. Her story is one of grit, intelligence, and a touch of theatrical flair. She was a woman who could charm a room full of dignitaries one moment and cut through Byzantine red tape the next. In a world where women were often sidelined, Theodora took center stage and made sure the spotlight stayed on her. So, as we continue to explore her life, remember that Theodora was more than just an empress. She was a trailblazer, a reformer, and perhaps most importantly, a survivor. Her journey from the Hippodrome to the halls of power is a saga of determination and defiance, proving that sometimes the best way to navigate a man's world is to rewrite the script entirely. And speaking of rewriting scripts, let's dive into the ultimate power couple of the Byzantine Empire, Theodora and Justinian. This wasn't your average meet-cute. It was more like a strategic merger of two political dynamos. Theodora, with her sharp wit and unapologetic ambition, met Justinian, an equally astute and ambitious man, at a time when both were poised to change the course of history. Their union was a heady mix of romance and realpolitik, a partnership that would shape the Byzantine Empire like a sculptor chiseling away at a block of marble. Now, this wasn't some fairy tale romance where they locked eyes across a crowded room and lived happily ever after. Oh no, this was Byzantine politics, where love was often a complex equation involving more strategy than a chess tournament. Justinian, who would become emperor in 527 AD, smitten not just with Theodora's beauty, but with her intelligence and political acumen. He saw in her a partner who could help him navigate the treacherous waters of imperial rule. And let's be honest, Theodora wasn't exactly a damsel waiting to be rescued. She was more like a general ready to march into battle, armed with ambition and an uncanny ability to read a room. Their marriage in 525 AD was a game-changer. By marrying Theodora, Justinian was making a bold statement. He valued brains as much as birthright. Sure, it ruffled a few feathers among the Byzantine elite, who thought an actress as Empress was a bit like casting a comedian in a Shakespearean drama. But Justinian had the foresight to see that Theodora's background gave her a unique understanding of the empire's social fabric. And let's talk about power dynamics for a second. Forget the notion that Theodora was merely the power behind the throne. She was very much alongside it, wielding influence with the precision of a seasoned politician. Justinian might have been the headliner, but Theodora was the co-star who often stole the show. They were like the Lennon and McCartney of Byzantine governance, each bringing their own genius to the table and creating something greater than the sum of their parts. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. Theodora faced significant pushback from those who saw her rise as an affront to the established order. But she was nothing if not resilient. She and Justinian played the long game, using their combined strengths to outmaneuver their detractors. They were a team that understood the art of compromise and collaboration, a rare combination in an era when political marriages were often more about convenience than cooperation. Now, if you're imagining Theodora as a puppet, think again. She was a formidable force in her own right, and her legislative initiatives were a testament to her influence. She championed laws that were revolutionary for the time, advocating for the rights of women and the disenfranchised. Imagine a world where women had little to no agency, and then imagine Theodora pushing for laws that allowed women to own property and seek divorce. It was like dropping a feminist manifesto into a patriarchal playbook. Theodora's influence wasn't just limited to social reforms. She was also a shrewd political operator, often serving as Justinian's most trusted advisor. She had a knack for crisis management, a skill that came in handy during the Nika riots of 532 AD, a massive uprising that threatened to topple Justinian's rule. While others advocated for a hasty retreat, Theodora stood firm, delivering a speech that was part battle cry, part pep talk. She famously declared, "Royal purple is the best burial shroud," effectively telling Justinian that she'd rather die an empress than live in exile. Talk about commitment to the cause. Her decisive actions during the riots not only saved Justinian's throne, but also cemented her legacy as a leader who could stand toe-to-toe with anyone in the Byzantine power structure. It was a defining moment that showcased her ability to rise to the occasion, even when the stakes were higher than a kite in a hurricane. But let's not gloss over the complexities of their relationship. While they were undoubtedly partners in power, the dynamics of their marriage were a reflection of the Byzantine court, where alliances were as fluid as the Bosphorus currents. They navigated jealousy, intrigue, and betrayal with the finesse of seasoned diplomats, often presenting a united front even when internal tensions simmered beneath the surface. Theodora's story is a masterclass in the art of influence. She understood that power wasn't just about titles or thrones. It was about the ability to effect change and bend the arc of history. In a world where women were often sidelined, she made sure her voice was not just heard, but amplified. She wielded her influence like a maestro conducting an orchestra, each note carefully chosen to create a symphony of reform and governance. So, as we continue to unravel the tapestry of her life, remember that Theodora and Justinian's partnership was more than just a historical footnote. It was a testament to the power of collaboration and the impact of visionary leadership. They were architects of an empire, building a legacy that would echo through the corridors of history long after their reign had ended. As the Byzantine Empire's dynamic duo, Justinian and Theodora orchestrated their symphony of reform and governance. A storm was brewing in the heart of Constantinople. The year was 532 AD, and the stage was set for one of the most dramatic episodes of their reign, the infamous Nika riots. Picture this. The city, usually bustling with merchants and charioteers, had transformed into a cauldron of chaos. This wasn't just your run-of-the-mill protest. It was an all-out rebellion that looked more like a scene from a dystopian epic than a civil uprising. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of what sparked this powder keg. The Nika riots were born out of a perfect storm of political discontent, social unrest, and a hefty dose of sporting rivalry. You see, Constantinople wasn't just the capital of an empire. It was home to the Hippodrome, the beating heart of Byzantine entertainment. Here, two chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, held sway over the city's populace. Think of them as the medieval answer to football hooligans, only with more toga action and less face paint. Initially, the Blues and Greens were just rivals on the track, but over time, they evolved into powerful political entities. Their influence extended beyond the Hippodrome, seeping into the very fabric of Byzantine society. And when the empire's citizens felt the pinch of heavy taxes and the sting of political corruption, it was these factions that became the mouthpieces for their frustrations. By 532, tensions had reached a boiling point, and the simmering discontent exploded into what we now know as the Nika riots. It all kicked off in January of that year, during a routine chariot race. What was supposed to be an afternoon of sport and spectacle quickly descended into violence. Rioters, egged on by the blues and greens, took to the streets shouting Nika, meaning conquer, and began torching buildings, including the Hagia Sophia and parts of the imperial palace. For a solid week, Constantinople was in flames, and the empire teetered on the brink of collapse. As the city burned, the imperial court was in a state of panic. Justinian, facing the very real threat of being overthrown, was ready to do what any sensible, self-preserving emperor would consider: pack his bags and hightail it out of there. But here's where Theodora steps into the spotlight with all the flair of a seasoned performer making a grand entrance. While many of Justinian's advisors were urging him to flee, Theodora was having none of it. She saw the writing on the wall and knew that their reign, and the very future of the empire, hung in the balance. In a moment that would go down in history, Theodora delivered a speech that was as much a rallying cry as it was a declaration of defiance. Channeling her inner Cersei Lannister, she declared, "The royal purple is the noblest shroud," basically telling everyone that she'd rather die as an empress than live as a fugitive. Talk about spine-chilling commitment. This was no time for half-measures or cowardice, and Theodora's words were the verbal equivalent of a slap across the face with a silk glove. Theodora's resolve was a game-changer. Her fiery determination snapped Justinian out of his funk and injected a dose of steely resolve into the imperial camp. The emperor, now galvanized by his wife's indomitable spirit, decided to fight back. He ordered his generals, including the formidable Belisarius, to suppress the revolt with force. And suppress they did. Within days, the imperial forces launched a counterattack that crushed the riots and restored order to the smoking ruins of Constantinople. The streets ran red with the blood of an estimated 30,000 rioters, a grim reminder of the cost of rebellion. But while the immediate threat was quelled, the aftermath of the Nika riots left a legacy that would echo throughout Justinian's reign. For Theodora, her actions during this crisis cemented her reputation as a force to be reckoned with, woman who could not only hold her own in the male-dominated world of Byzantine politics, but also shape the course of history with the sheer force of her will. Her speech became legendary, a testament to her tenacity and her ability to rise to the occasion when everything seemed lost. In the grand tapestry of Byzantine history, the Nika riots were a defining moment, a crucible that tested the mettle of both Justinian and Theodora. It was a stark reminder that power, once gained, is never secure, and that sometimes the most significant battles are fought not with swords and shields, but with words and resolve. Theodora had stared down the abyss and emerged victorious, proving that even in the darkest of times, a single voice can turn the tide. As we continue to explore the intricate dance of power and politics that characterized Theodora's life, remember that the Empress was more than just a figurehead. She was a trailblazer in every sense of the word, a woman whose legacy was built not just on her titles, but on her actions. The Nika riots were just one chapter in her extraordinary story, a testament to her ability to navigate the turbulent waters of Byzantine rule with grace and grit. Stay tuned, because Theodora's tale doesn't end here. Her influence would continue to be felt in the years to come, as she and Justinian embarked on ambitious projects to rebuild and restore their empire. From monumental architecture to sweeping legal reforms, their partnership would leave an indelible mark on history, a legacy that would endure long after the fires of rebellion had been extinguished. Now, as the dust settled and the smoke from the Nika riots dissipated, Theodora was left with a city in need of rebuilding and an empire demanding reform. With the hippodrome back to hosting chariot races instead of riots, Theodora could finally turn her attention to one of her most enduring legacies, her legislative achievements. And believe me, these were no mere footnotes in a dusty old manuscript. They were the kind of reforms that make you wonder if Theodora had access to a time machine and a modern feminist handbook. Let's start with women's rights, a subject that, in 6th century Byzantium, had about as much clout as a snowball in the Sahara. Theodora was not content to let half the population languish in legal obscurity. One of her landmark reforms focused on marriage and divorce, areas where women were often at the mercy of their husbands. She pushed for laws that granted women more rights in divorce proceedings, allowing them to retain dowries and ensuring they weren't left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. In a world where women's rights were usually discussed in whispers, Theodora was practically shouting from the rooftops. But let's not get carried away with the image of Theodora as a proto-feminist warrior. Sure, her reforms were groundbreaking, but they were also shrewdly political. Granting women greater rights in marriage wasn't just about gender equality. It was about stabilizing the social fabric. By giving women more security, Theodora was actually strengthening family units, and by extension, the empire itself. It was less about smashing the patriarchy and more about fortifying the state, though I doubt many women complained about the side effects. And speaking of smashing, Theodora had no tolerance for exploitation. She took a sledgehammer to the abhorrent practice of forced prostitution. With a past that had exposed her to the darker sides of society, she knew better than most the cruelty and injustice women faced. Theodora enacted laws that imposed harsher penalties on those who trafficked women, dragging the issue of human trafficking into the Byzantine sunlight. She even established a convent on the Asian side of the Bosporus as a refuge for women who had been forced into prostitution, a sanctuary offering a new lease on life. Now, let's put aside the romanticized vision of Theodora as a one-woman crusade against injustice. Her motivations were complex. By curbing human trafficking and forced prostitution, she was also reducing the power of pimps and brothel owners who often wielded significant influence and could destabilize urban areas. It was a strategic move to consolidate imperial control, enhance public order, and yes, give exploited women a chance for a better life. Because in the grand chessboard of Byzantine politics, every pawn mattered. Of course, every silver lining has a cloud, and Theodora's reforms didn't exactly transform Byzantium into a utopia overnight. The societal impact was significant, but uneven. Many women found new legal protections, yet the cultural currents of the time meant that changes were often slow to trickle down to the average citizen. Theodora might have been the Empress, but she wasn't a miracle worker. She couldn't just snap her fingers and change societal attitudes. What she could do, and did brilliantly, was lay the groundwork for future progress. Let's not ignore the economic context either. Theodora's reforms had ripple effects throughout the Byzantine economy. By stabilizing families and providing better protections, she contributed to a more predictable social order, which in turn created a more stable economic environment. And let's face it, a stable economy is the kind of thing that warms an emperor's heart, right next to a successful military campaign and a well-stocked treasury. Theodora's legislative achievements were a masterstroke of governance, blending compassion with calculation. She understood that true power lay not just in ruling, but in shaping the very laws and norms that governed people's lives. In a world where women were often seen as secondary characters in the grand narrative, Theodora was rewriting the script, ensuring they had more than just walk-on roles. So, as we look at Theodora's life, remember that her influence extended far beyond the walls of the palace. She wasn't just an empress. She was a legislator and a visionary, a woman who saw the potential for change and seized it with both hands. Her story is a reminder that power, when wielded wisely, can create ripples that last for centuries. And in the annals of history, Theodora's ripples turned into waves. Stay tuned, because there's more to this Byzantine powerhouse than meets the eye. Theodora's influence was a testament to the alchemy of power and foresight, a saga that would echo long after the final curtain fell on her life in 548 AD. So, let's dive into her closing act. No spoilers, but it involves a legacy that could rival any epic finale. When Theodora passed away at the age of 48, she left behind a Byzantine empire forever changed by her hand. Her death was attributed to a likely case of cancer, and while the disease claimed her body, it was powerless against the impact she'd carved into the annals of history. Justinian was reportedly devastated, mourning the loss not just of his wife, but of his most formidable ally. The empire, too, felt the seismic shift as the woman who had reshaped its very laws and social structures was laid to rest. But here's where history gets juicy, the dichotomy of Theodora's legacy. As with any larger-than-life figure, her story is one of contradictions and complexities that historians have debated with the fervor of a political talk show. Was she a saintly reformer or a cunning power player? a champion of the downtrodden, or an opportunist with a penchant for Machiavellian moves. The truth, as always, is a cocktail of both, and it's less about choosing sides than appreciating the blend. On one hand, Theodora was revered for her social reforms, the kind that would make even the most progressive modern legislator nod in approval. Her efforts to bolster women's rights and curb human trafficking were nothing short of revolutionary. In a society where women were often relegated to the shadows, she dragged them into the Byzantine spotlight, insisting they deserve a say in their destinies. In her convents and legal edicts, Theodora was a beacon of hope for those seeking a life beyond their prescribed roles. Yet Theodora's rise to power was not without its shadows. Her background in the theatre, rife with tales of scandal and seduction, made her both a target for gossip and a master of intrigue. The Byzantine court was a snake pit of jealousy and ambition, and Theodora navigated it with the grace of a seasoned performer. Her detractors painted her as a manipulative force, someone who wielded power with a velvet glove and an iron fist. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was a chess master, with every move calculated to secure her position and that of the empire she co-ruled. What about the myths that swirl around her like mist on the Bosphorus? Well, they are as fascinating as they are misleading. Take, for instance, the oft-repeated tale of her being a courtesan turned empress, a narrative that has more to do with male-dominated historiography than reality. Yes, her early life was far from conventional, but it was her acumen and resilience that propelled her to greatness. Theodora didn't simply marry into power. She was power incarnate, reshaping the empire alongside Justinian with a vision that was as bold as it was effective. And let's not forget the economic dimension of her reforms, which were as strategic as they were social. By stabilizing families and curbing exploitation, Theodora was astutely aware that a content populace was less likely to revolt, a lesson surely imprinted on her psyche after the tumult of the Nika riots. In bolstering the social fabric, she was also ensuring a stable economic landscape that allowed the empire to flourish. For Theodora, social justice wasn't just a moral imperative, it was a political one. Fast forward to the modern era, and Theodora's legacy continues to captivate and confound. She's been immortalized in art, literature, and even opera, a testament to her enduring allure. Yet, the challenge remains to separate the woman from the legend, to understand her not as a caricature of virtue or vice, but as a complex figure who wielded her influence with unparalleled skill. In a world that often simplifies historical figures into neat little boxes, Theodora defies categorization, and therein lies her power. Her story is a reminder that history is not a static narrative, but a living, breathing entity, shaped by those who dare to challenge the status quo. Theodora's life was a masterclass in the art of reinvention and resilience, a saga that continues to resonate in a world still grappling with issues of gender equality and social justice. She may have exited the stage centuries ago, but her influence echoes on, a reminder that the past is never truly past. It is the foundation upon which the future is built. So, as we close the curtains on Theodora's tale, remember that her legacy is not just etched in stone or inscribed in ancient texts. It lives in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality, in the relentless pursuit of a fairer world. Theodora was more than an empress. She was a force of nature, a woman who dared to dream big in an age that tried to silence her. And for that, she will forever be a beacon of hope and a testament to the power of one. In 1485, Hernán Cortés entered the world in Medellin, Spain, a town so small you might miss it if you blinked. His family, while noble in name, were about as wealthy as a college student living on instant noodles. Young Hernán grew up in a modest setting, which probably explains why he had a taste for adventure, anything to escape the monotony of everyday life. Let's set the record straight. Cortés wasn't exactly an honor roll student. His parents, hoping he'd bring some prestige to the family, packed him off to the University of Salamanca. The university, founded in 1134, was one of the top institutions of the time, but Hernán was about as interested in academics as a cat is in taking a bath. His stint there was brief, like blink and you'll miss it brief. The lectures on law and Latin failed to captivate him, and if you'd asked him about his favorite part of university life, he'd probably tell you it was leaving. Cortés was more of a hands-on learner, which sounds great until you realize that meant he was more interested in brawling and carousing than cracking open a book. After abandoning his academic pursuits faster than a squirrel with ADHD, Cortés dabbled in law, thinking it might be a nice way to earn a living. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. He found legal work to be about as thrilling as watching grass grow. Instead of making a name for himself in the courtrooms of Spain, he realized that his real calling lay elsewhere. That elsewhere turned out to be across the Atlantic Ocean, in the vast, uncharted lands of the New World. In 1504, at the ripe age of 19, Cortés decided to cash in his chips and set sail for Hispaniola, the island now split between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. His decision was as much about seeking fortune as it was about fleeing trouble. You see, there was a bit of a scandal involving a local nobleman's daughter, and Cortés decided it was best to be scarce. With no money in his pockets, but plenty of ambition in his heart, he boarded a ship bound for the unknown. The voyage across the Atlantic wasn't for the faint-hearted. Imagine being crammed onto a wooden ship with hundreds of other hopefuls, all dreaming of gold and glory. The trip could take anywhere from 1 to 3 months, depending on the whims of the wind and sea. Cortés, not exactly a fan of cramped spaces, must have found the journey excruciating. But he was driven by the promise of opportunity and adventure, a promise that, like a carrot on a stick, dangled just out of reach. Arriving in Hispaniola, Cortés found himself in a world that was both familiar and foreign. The Spanish had established a foothold on the island, and there were opportunities for a young, ambitious man to make a name for himself. He started by doing what any sensible newcomer would, ingratiate himself with the powers that be. Through a combination of charm and cunning, Cortés secured a position as a notary in the town of Azua. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Cortés' early days in the New World were marked by a mix of adventure and misadventure. He was involved in multiple expeditions, some of which ended in success, others in disaster. But each experience only fueled his insatiable appetite for more. He had a knack for finding himself in the thick of things, whether it was skirmishes with the indigenous peoples or power struggles among the Spanish settlers. His ability to navigate these treacherous waters earned him a reputation as a formidable player in the colonial game. Despite the trials and tribulations, Cortés was undeterred. He saw the New World not as a land of insurmountable challenges, but as a blank canvas on which he could paint his destiny. This was a man who was willing to risk everything for the chance to carve out a legacy. Little did he know that legacy would be both celebrated and vilified for centuries to come. As the curtain rose on the next act of his life, Hernán Cortés was poised for greatness, or infamy, depending on who you ask. With a head full of dreams and a heart full of ambition, he was ready to take on whatever the New World had to throw at him, and throw it would. But for now, the young, rebellious Cortés was just beginning to find his footing in a land that promised to change his life, and the course of history, forever. And so, Hernán Cortés found himself standing on the rugged shores of Hispaniola, the gateway to the New World, and an exotic playground for every starving, glory-hungry Spaniard who could afford the fare. If the island had a motto, it might have been, "Here be opportunities," a siren call for young adventurers and the reckless alike. With the ink barely dry on his notary papers and ambition burning brighter than a midsummer bonfire, Cortés was ready to make moves, not just footprints on the sandy shores. Fast forward to 1511, and Cortés, ever the opportunist, decided it was time to pack his bags and set sail yet again, this time to Cuba. The island had just been discovered by Diego Velázquez, a man whose name sounds like a villain from a cheap paperback, but was, in fact, the governor of the newly Spanish-claimed territory. Velázquez was on the lookout for capable men to help him manage, the bountiful resources and the indigenous peoples who inconveniently already lived there. Now, if there's one thing to know about Cortés, it's that he could charm the pants off a mannequin. So when he arrived in Cuba, he quickly became buddy-buddy with Velázquez. It was a relationship built on mutual interest and necessity, like two sharks circling the same prey. Velázquez needed competent men to run his burgeoning colony, and Cortés needed a springboard to propel him into the annals of history or infamy. Cortés proved to be a man of many talents, not least of which was his ability to ingratiate himself with those in power. He was appointed the mayor, or more officially, the alcalde of Santiago, a position that sounds impressive until you realize that Santiago was less a bustling metropolis and more a collection of huts with big dreams. But hey, you have to start somewhere, right? Besides, the role came with perks, like a share of the spoils from the island's caciques, the indigenous chiefs who were coerced into coughing up tributes to their new overlords. As mayor, Cortés demonstrated a knack for administration, proving that sometimes a little elbow grease can grease the wheels of opportunity. He knew how to get things done, whether it was organizing labor or smoothing over the occasional uprising. No job was too small or too dirty. He was a man on the rise, and his eyes were set on bigger prizes than the modest wealth of Santiago. Of course, power in the New World was as unstable as a house of cards in a hurricane. Diego Velázquez, with his own ambitions and insecurities, began eyeing Cortés with the suspicion of a jealous lover. It didn't help that Cortés had a reputation for being, shall we say, assertive in his dealings. Velázquez had heard whispers of Cortés's ambition, and like any good politician, he knew that trust is a currency best spent sparingly. By 1518, Cortés was itching for a new adventure, and the buzz about a place called Mexico reached his ears. It was rumored to be a land dripping with gold and ruled by powerful kings. The tales were as tantalizing as they were terrifying, a mix of myth and reality that could make any adventurer's heart race. Velázquez himself had plans to explore Mexico, but he knew better than to trust Cortés with such an expedition. The governor's suspicions were as palpable as a storm on the horizon, yet Cortés wore his ambition like a badge of honor. Despite Velázquez's reservations, Cortés managed to secure command of an expedition to Mexico. It was a classic case of speak softly and carry a big stick, with Cortés wielding the kind of persuasive power that left even the most seasoned operators nodding in agreement. It helped that Cortés promised to share the wealth with Velázquez, a sweetener to seal the deal. But if history tells us anything, it's that promises are as easily broken as they are made. Just as Cortés was about to set sail, Velázquez had a change of heart. Maybe it was a nagging feeling, a premonition that his protégé might just outshine him, or perhaps it was the realization that Cortés's loyalty was as reliable as a paper umbrella in a downpour. Whatever the reason, Velázquez ordered the expedition to be cancelled. But Cortés, not one to let a little thing like orders stand in his way, decided to make a move that would cement his reputation as a maverick and a legend, or a rogue, depending on who you asked. Cortés set sail in February 1519, with or without Velázquez's blessing. It was a bold move, the kind that makes or breaks a man. The fleet consisted of 11 ships, with about 500 men, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons. It was a motley crew, driven by the promise of riches and the allure of adventure. The sea was their highway to fortune, and Mexico was the promised land. As the ships cut through the waves towards the unknown, Cortés must have felt a mix of exhilaration and apprehension. He was a man standing on the precipice of destiny, ready to leap into the pages of history. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the ages, a tale of conquest, betrayal, and ambition that would redefine the world as they knew it. Cortés's journey was just beginning, a path littered with challenges that would test his mettle and his morals. For now, as the coastline of Mexico loomed on the horizon, the future was a tantalizing mystery, a story yet to be written. And Hernán Cortés, ever the audacious adventurer, was ready to write it in bold, indelible strokes. As Cortés and his ragtag crew of adventurers approached the Yucatan Peninsula, the promise of uncharted lands and untapped wealth was as tantalizing as a mirage in the desert. The year was 1519, and the New World was still a jigsaw puzzle waiting to be pieced together by those daring or reckless enough to try. Cortés, with his penchant for risk-taking and a flair for the dramatic, was about to embark on a campaign that would make even the most jaded treasure hunter sit up and take notice. Landing with all the subtlety of a rock band crashing a library, Cortés and his men set foot on the sandy shores of what is now Mexico. The Yucatan Peninsula, with its lush jungles and mysterious ruins, must have seemed like a scene straight out of an adventure novel. But this wasn't just any vacation. Cortés was here on business, and his business was conquest. The local tribes, understandably less than thrilled by the arrival of these heavily armed strangers, were a mixed bag of curiosity and caution. Cortés, channeling his inner diplomat, knew that the key to success was forging alliances. Think of him as a colonial-era networker, shaking hands and making deals like a door-to-door salesman with a particularly sharp pitch. But instead of vacuum cleaners, he was peddling promises of protection and prosperity, an offer that came with fine print as long as a Spanish novel. Enter La Malinche, a figure as enigmatic as she was pivotal. Her real name was Malinsin, but history, with its penchant for nicknames, would remember her as La Malinche. Born into a noble family, she was sold into slavery as a child, a fate not uncommon in the turbulent world of Mesoamerican politics. But if life had dealt her a tough hand, she played it with the skill of a seasoned card shark. La Malinche quickly became not just a translator, but a confidante and advisor to Cortés, a role that's often overshadowed by his own towering legend. La Malinche spoke both Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Mayan, making her an invaluable asset in negotiations. To say she was merely a translator is like calling Shakespeare a scriptwriter. Her contributions went beyond words. She was a bridge between cultures, a mediator in a world on the brink of upheaval. Yet, history has often painted her as a traitor, an unfair label considering the complex dynamics at play. In reality, she was navigating a labyrinth of loyalties and survival, and doing it with a grace that would make any modern diplomat green with envy. Now, let's talk about the infamous decision that's become the stuff of legend. Cortés ordering his ships to be scuttled. Yes, you heard that right. After arriving in Mexico, he decided to burn, or rather, dismantle, his fleet, leaving no room for second thoughts or retreat. It was a move that screams commitment issues more than strategic genius, but it's been romanticized as an act of daring resolve. The truth, it was a calculated risk, born out of necessity. Cortés knew that the only way to keep his men focused on the mission was to eliminate the option of turning tail. After all, nothing sharpens the mind like the prospect of no escape. This bold move had the dual purpose of cementing the loyalty of his men and sending a message to the local tribes. The Spaniards were here to stay. It was a psychological play, but also a logistical gamble. Without ships, Cortés was betting on his ability to forge alliances and secure resources locally. It was the 16th century equivalent of burning your resume after landing a job offer, dramatic, risky, and not for the faint-hearted. Cortés's next steps were all about building a coalition. He navigated the complicated web of Mesoamerican politics with the finesse of a chess master, pitting tribes against one another while offering protection and partnership to those who sided with him. It's a strategy as old as time, divide and conquer. But Cortés took it to a new level, effectively turning the region's internal rivalries to his advantage. The Tlaxcalans, bitter enemies of the Aztecs, were among the first to throw their lot in with the Spaniards. For them, Cortés represented a chance to even the score with their powerful neighbors. The alliance was not without its tensions. Trust was a scarce commodity, but necessity made for strange bedfellows. Cortés, ever the opportunist, knew how to exploit these alliances to his benefit, weaving a tapestry of diplomacy and coercion that would ultimately lead him to the gates of Tenochtitlan. As the Conquistador's forces expanded, so did his audacity. Cortés was now at the center of a burgeoning power base, a force to be reckoned with in a land that was as rich in potential as it was fraught with danger. His men, bolstered by local allies and buoyed by the promise of riches, pushed deeper into the heart of the Aztec Empire, each step a gamble, each victory a testament to the power of ambition. But the road to Tenochtitlan was anything but smooth. The journey was a gauntlet of skirmishes and negotiations, each encounter a reminder of the precariousness of their mission. Cortés's charisma and cunning were as crucial as his sword, as he navigated the treacherous waters of Mesoamerican politics. Yet, for all his skill, the specter of betrayal loomed large, a constant companion in a land where allegiances could shift as quickly as the tides. In this high-stakes game, Cortés was both player and pawn, ever aware that the fortunes of war could turn on a dime. His exploits were chronicled and mythologized, tales of daring and deceit that would echo through the ages. But beneath the legend lay a man driven by ambition and necessity, a conquistador who understood that the path to glory was paved with risk and sacrifice. As Cortés continued his march towards Tenochtitlan, the stage was set for a showdown of epic proportions. The Aztec Empire, with its wealth and power, was a prize worth any risk. But it was also a formidable adversary, one that would test Cortés and his allies to their limits. The journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty, a tightrope walk between triumph and disaster. And so, with the winds of fate at his back and the weight of history on his shoulders, Hernán Cortés pressed on, his eyes fixed on the horizon and the promise of conquest. The story was far from over, the outcome still unwritten. But one thing was certain. Cortés was a man who wouldn't just settle for a footnote in history. He was writing his own epic, one bold stroke at a time, in a land where legends were made and broken with equal fervor. The path to Tenochtitlan was a gauntlet of challenges, each more daunting than the last. Cortés, ever the master of turning lemons into lemonade, or in his case, adversity into opportunity, continued his relentless advance. The year was 1521, and the Aztec capital loomed like a siren on the horizon, promising riches and peril in equal measure. This was not just a march. It was a chess game played on a grand scale, with Cortés as the audacious grandmaster. But before we get to the grand finale, let's address one of the most persistent myths surrounding this saga, the notion that the Aztecs thought Cortés was a god. According to legend, Moctezuma Roman II, the reigning Aztec emperor, believed Cortés to be the reincarnation of Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent deity who was prophesied to return. It's a tale as fantastical as it is fascinating, but if you dig beneath the surface, the reality isn't quite so divine. In truth, the Aztecs were pragmatic people. They were deeply religious, yes, but not gullible. The notion that Moctezuma would roll out the red carpet for a bunch of bedraggled, armor-clad Europeans on the off chance that they were gods stretches the imagination. More likely, Moctezuma was hedging his bets, trying to buy time to assess the threat these strangers posed. Picture him as a CEO dealing with a hostile takeover. He was cautious, not credulous. So, if the godlike status was more fiction than fact, what really tipped the scales in Cortés's favor? Enter smallpox, the uninvited guest that would play a starring role in this drama. The virus hitched a ride with the Spaniards, and it was as devastating as it was invisible. Smallpox spread like wildfire through the densely populated Aztec Empire, decimating entire communities. The Aztecs had no immunity to this old-world disease, and it ravaged them with a ferocity that even the most seasoned warrior couldn't match. Cortés couldn't have planned it better if he tried, though he didn't, because, germ warfare wasn't really in the playbook back then. As the Aztecs grappled with this invisible enemy, Cortés was busy securing alliances with indigenous groups who had their own grudges against the Aztec overlords. The Tlaxcalans, for one, had no love lost for their neighbors. It was a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and Cortés played this to maximum effect. His coalition wasn't just a ragtag band of conquistadors. It was a formidable force, bolstered by thousands of local warriors who saw an opportunity to overthrow the Aztec yoke. Now, let's talk tactics. When it came to military strategies, Cortés was no slouch. He understood the importance of psychological warfare, and he used it to keep his enemies, and sometimes his allies, off balance. His men, though outnumbered, were equipped with steel swords, crossbows, and arquebuses, early firearms that were as loud as they were deadly. To the Aztecs, who were used to obsidian blades and slingshots, these weapons were as alien as the men wielding them. The conquest of Tenochtitlan wasn't a swift coup, but a drawn-out siege that dragged on for months. The Spaniards and their allies cut off the city's supply lines, isolating it from the outside world. It was a textbook siege, a slow chokehold that tightened with every passing day. The Aztecs, fierce and resilient, fought back with everything they had, but they were fighting an enemy that was as relentless as he was resourceful. The streets of Tenochtitlan became a battleground, a dance of death where every corner held the promise of ambush or escape. The city's canals, once bustling with commerce, became arteries of conflict, as warriors clashed in the shadow of the Great Pyramids. It was chaos, pure and simple, a maelstrom of violence and desperation. Cortés's forces, buoyed by their technological edge and sheer tenacity, pushed deeper into the city. On August 13, 1521, the Aztec capital finally fell, its magnificent temples and palaces reduced to ruins. The conquest was complete, but at what cost? The city, once a jewel of Mesoamerican civilization, lay in tatters, a testament to the destructive power of ambition and greed. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked a turning point in history, a moment that would echo through the ages. Cortés had achieved the impossible, but his victory was as bittersweet as it was monumental. The city he'd conquered was a shadow of its former self, its people decimated by disease and war. The riches he sought were elusive, like a mirage that dissolved upon closer inspection. As for Cortés's legend, it was now etched in the annals of history, a tale of daring and duplicity that would inspire awe and revulsion in equal measure. He was hailed as a hero by some, a villain by others, a man who dared to dream big and had the audacity to turn that dream into reality. Consequences be damned. Yet, for all the glory and infamy, the conquest of Tenochtitlan was not the end of the story. It was merely a chapter, a prelude to the tumultuous years that lay ahead. Cortés had opened Pandora's box, unleashing forces that would reshape the New World in ways he could scarcely imagine. The Aztec Empire was no more, but its legacy would endure, a haunting reminder of a civilization that had once thrived under the sun. As Cortés surveyed the ruins of his triumph, one might wonder if he felt a pang of regret, a fleeting moment of doubt in the wake of his monumental achievement. But if history tells us anything, it's that Cortés was a man who rarely looked back. He was a conquistador, driven by a relentless pursuit of glory, a man for whom the next adventure was always just over the horizon. The story of Hernán Cortés and the fall of Tenochtitlan is a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, betrayal, and resilience. It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white, but a complex mosaic of human endeavor. And as we turn the page to the next chapter, we find ourselves standing on the threshold of a new era, a time of exploration and exploitation, where the echoes of the Aztec Empire linger like whispers in the wind. So stay tuned, because the saga of Hernán Cortés is far from over. The stage is set for new adventures, new challenges, and perhaps a reckoning with the ghosts of the past. After all, history has a way of repeating itself, and the past, as they say, is prologue. The saga of Hernán Cortés, that audacious conquistador with a knack for drama, was far from over. As the dust settled over Tenochtitlan, Cortés found himself at the helm of what was now called New Spain. But if he thought conquering the Aztecs was the hard part, he was in for a rude awakening. Governing a fledgling empire was like juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle. One misstep, and the whole thing could come crashing down. Cortés's initial attempts to govern were met with the kind of resistance you'd expect if you tried to replace everyone's morning coffee with decaf. The local populations weren't exactly rolling out the red carpet, and the Spanish settlers, well, they were about as cooperative as a herd of cats. Cortés had to contend with a cacophony of complaints, from disgruntled conquistadors demanding land to indigenous leaders pushing back against their new overlords. It was like herding chickens while simultaneously trying to keep the foxes at bay. Despite the chaos, Cortés wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. He set about establishing a capital in the ruins of Tenochtitlan, now rechristened Mexico City. It was a bold move, like building a new house on the ashes of the old while the embers were still warm. By 1524, Mexico City was rising from the rubble, a testament to Spanish ambition and the resilience of the human spirit. Yet, for all its burgeoning splendor, the city was a powder keg of tensions, a mosaic of cultures teetering on the edge of eruption. Cortés's rule was a tightrope walk between diplomacy and domination, with each decision scrutinized by allies and enemies alike. His knack for negotiation was tested to its limits, as he sought to balance the demands of the Spanish crown with the realities on the ground. It was a political game of chess, but with the stakes higher than a kite in a hurricane. Every move was calculated, every alliance a potential pitfall. And yet, for a time, Cortés managed to keep the pieces in play, orchestrating a tenuous peace in a land ripe with potential and peril. But the winds of change were already stirring, as whispers of discontent reached the ears of the Spanish court. Back in Spain, King Charles V eyed his colonial governor with a mix of admiration and suspicion. Cortés, ever the maverick, had a reputation for bending the rules, and the king wasn't about to let one man have too much power. In 1528, Cortés was summoned back to Spain to account for his actions, a summons as ominous as it was unavoidable. Cortés's return to Spain was a homecoming of sorts, but not the triumphal parade he might have imagined. Instead, it was a trial by fire, as he faced accusations of mismanagement and misconduct. The Spanish court, with its labyrinthine politics and endless intrigue, was a far cry from the rugged frontiers of the New World. It was a place where words were weapons, and Cortés had to navigate its treacherous waters with the skill of a seasoned sailor in a storm. Despite the challenges, Cortés was nothing if not persuasive. His charisma, honed in the crucible of conquest, served him well as he defended his actions before the king. He spun tales of adventure and adversity, painting a picture of a man driven by duty and destiny. It was a master-class in rhetoric, and for a time it seemed to work. Charles V, impressed by Cortés's audacity and achievements, reinstated him as the governor of New Spain, albeit with clipped wings and tighter reins. Back in the New World, however, the tides had shifted. The Spanish bureaucracy, ever eager to exert control, had appointed new officials to oversee the colonies, and Cortés found himself sidelined in his own empire. It was like being demoted from conductor to a mere passenger on a train he'd once driven. The frustration was palpable, a stark contrast to the heady days of conquest and camaraderie. Yet, Cortés was not one to fade quietly into the background. He pivoted, channeling his energy into new ventures. In 1536, he set sail for the Pacific in search of new territories to explore and exploit. His expeditions took him as far as the Baja California Peninsula, but the riches he sought remained as elusive as a mirage in the desert. It was a sobering reminder that the world still held mysteries beyond even Cortés's formidable reach. As the years wore on, the once-feared conquistador found himself grappling with a new adversary: time. The youthful vigor that had propelled him across the Atlantic was giving way to the weariness of age. By the 1540, Cortés was a man out of step with the changing world, a relic of a bygone era. He returned to Spain, where he spent his final years in relative obscurity, a shadow of the legend he'd once been. On December 2, 1547, Hernán Cortés passed away, leaving behind a legacy as complex as it was controversial. He died at the age of 62, a ripe old age by the standards of the time, especially for someone who'd lived life on the edge. His death marked the end of an era, but his story was far from over. History, with its penchant for revision and reinterpretation, would continue to grapple with the legacy of Hernán Cortés. Was he a hero or a villain? A visionary or a rogue? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Cortés was a man shaped by his time, a product of a world defined by conquest and colonization. He was driven by ambition and audacity, yet his actions left an indelible mark on the course of history. As we reflect on the life of Hernán Cortés, we must grapple with the myths and realities that surround his legacy. He was a man of contradictions, as flawed as he was formidable. His story is a reminder that history is not a tidy narrative, but a tapestry of human experience, woven with threads of triumph and tragedy. In the end, Hernán Cortés's legacy is like a Twitter debate that never ends, a whirlwind of opinions and interpretations that defy easy categorization. He was a man who dared to dream, to challenge the status quo, and to carve out a place in the annals of history. And while his actions were often divisive, they were undeniably transformative, leaving a lasting imprint on the world he helped to shape. So, as we close the chapter on Hernán Cortés, let us remember him not just as a conqueror, but as a man, a figure whose life and legacy continue to captivate and confound, to inspire and to provoke. For in the end, it is not the myths we remember, but the man behind them, a testament to the complexities of the human spirit and the enduring power of history. Jolt awake as the sun starts its ambitious climb over the ancient city of Tyre, casting a golden hue that promises a bustling day ahead. Tyre isn't just any port city. It's the Wall Street of the ancient world, a place where deals are made and fortunes are won or lost with the rise and fall of the Mediterranean tide. You can almost smell the sea salt mingling with the aroma of cedar wood, a scent as valuable as gold itself, if you believe the ancient hype. As you slip out of bed and into your tunic, you're already mentally checking off today's agenda. You, my friend, are a Phoenician merchant, part of a trade network that's basically the Instagram of antiquity. spreading your goods, ideas, and alphabet like cultural influencers of the Bronze Age. The Phoenicians were the original globetrotters, sailing from the Levant to the far reaches of the Iberian Peninsula, which, by the way, is a casual 300 miles away. Not bad for a seafaring people without GPS, right? Now, about that cedar wood. You might be wondering why anyone would get so excited about timber. Well, in the ancient world, cedar was the creme de la creme of construction materials. It was resistant to rot and insects, perfect for building everything from temples to ships. The Egyptians used it for their pharaohs' coffins, and you can bet they paid a pretty penny for it. We're talking about a resource so prized that it might as well have come with its own security detail. As you step out into the narrow streets of Tyre, there's a chaotic harmony in the air. Merchants from all corners of the known world are here, haggling over textiles, papyrus, and of course that sweet, sweet cedar. You weave through the crowd, exchanging nods with fellow traders and avoiding the occasional donkey cart. Tyre is a hub, a place where cultures collide and commerce thrives. It's a city that never sleeps, or at least never rests on its laurels. Speaking of laurels, let's talk about how your people, the Phoenicians, decided that spreading the alphabet was a good idea. Spoiler alert, it was. Unlike the verbose Egyptians with their hieroglyphs or the enigmatic Sumerians with cuneiform, you folks figured out that an alphabet with a mere 22 characters could get the job done. No need for a Rosetta Stone when you can just scribble a note that says, "Hey, got any cedar?" And everyone gets the message. So why does any of this matter? Well, think of it this way. Trade isn't just about goods. It's about ideas, culture, and influence. The Phoenicians didn't just move products. They moved the needle on civilization itself. The alphabet spread like wildfire, eventually finding its way into the hands of Greeks and Romans. Fast forward a couple of millennia, and we're still using it today. It's like a viral meme that never dies. As noon approaches, the sun beats down mercilessly, but that doesn't deter the crowd. You notice a new shipment of purple dye arriving at the docks. Ah, Tyrian purple, the color of royalty, literally. Extracted from the murex snail, it took about 250,000 snails to produce an ounce of dye. No wonder it was reserved for the 1% of the ancient world. Forget Gucci. This was the real status symbol. While you're tempted to linger and watch the unloading, you've got deals to make and ledgers to balance. You stride toward your own warehouse, a modest establishment compared to some, but well-organized and stocked with goods that are sure to fetch a handsome price. You can almost hear the clinking of coins now, silver shekels if you're lucky. Inside, your assistants are already at work. They're young, eager, and ready to learn the ins and outs of the trade. You take a moment to instruct them on the latest market trends. The Greeks are buying up olive oil like it's going out of style, and there's a growing demand for tin from the far-off British Isles. It's a risky business, but then again, fortune favors the bold, or at least those who can navigate the Mediterranean without sailing off the edge of the world. As the afternoon sun starts its descent, casting long shadows across the city, you take a moment to reflect. You're part of something bigger than just trade. You're a link in a chain that stretches across continents and cultures. The Phoenicians may not have built empires or conquered lands, but they connected them, one ship at a time. And there you have it, a morning in Tyre, the beating heart of ancient commerce, where cedar is gold, dye is royalty, and the alphabet is the gift that keeps on giving. As you wrap up your day, you can't help but feel a sense of pride. You're a merchant of the ancient world, a mover and shaker in a civilization that's as influential as it is enigmatic. And tomorrow, you'll do it all over again. As you wrap up your day, you can't help but feel a sense of pride. You're a merchant of the ancient world, a mover and shaker in a civilization that's as influential as it is enigmatic. And tomorrow, you'll do it all over again. But before you can bask in the glow of a day well spent, there's that small matter of selling your wares. This isn't just about stacking goods on a table and hoping for the best. Oh no, my friend, this is a full-contact sport of economics, logistics, and a fair bit of theatrical flair. First, let's talk logistics, because moving goods in ancient Phoenicia wasn't exactly a stroll down the Mediterranean promenade. That coveted Tyrian purple dye. It came from the murex snail, and extracting it was a process so labor-intensive, it made modern artisanal crafts look like fast food. The dye was literally worth its weight in silver, and transporting it safely across the high seas was akin to sending your kid to college. expensive and fraught with potential disasters. Imagine trying to keep an army of snails happy long enough to extract enough dye to color a cloak. Yeah, it sounds like a logistical nightmare, and that's because it was. Once you've got your purple gold and other goods ready to roll, you're faced with the hustle and bustle of the marketplace. Haggling is the name of the game here, and if you thought eBay bidding wars were intense, welcome to the ancient world's version. It's a dance of wits and words, where the price of goods can fluctuate more than a politician's promises. You need a degree in diplomacy just to keep your head above water. The merchants of Tyre were like the Shakespearean actors of commerce, masters of drama, comedy, and the occasional tragedy when a deal went south. And let's not forget the mathematics involved. Ancient merchants had to keep track of weights, measures, and conversion rates without the luxury of a calculator app. You're juggling shekels, talents, and those pesky drachmas from Greece. Mess up a conversion, and you might as well hand over your entire inventory for the bargain price of a loaf of bread. But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? In a world before Excel spreadsheets, you were doing mental gymnastics that would make a mathematician sweat. Now, here's where we debunk a myth or two. You might think that the Phoenician marketplace was a cutthroat arena where only the shrewdest survived. And while that's partially true, it's also a bit romanticized. Sure, there were plenty of sharp dealers, but many merchants relied on long-standing relationships and trust. After all, when your business partners are a boat ride away, you can't ghost them after a bad deal. Reputation was everything, and a good name was more valuable than a shipload of cedar. Speaking of cedar, let's take a moment to appreciate the economics of trade. Phoenicia wasn't rich in natural resources, so they had to get creative. They imported raw materials and exported finished goods, a strategy that transformed them into the middlemen of the ancient world. They were the Amazon prime of their day, except instead of drones, they used ships that didn't exactly come with tracking numbers. Despite, or perhaps because of, these challenges, the Phoenicians thrived, turning their lack of resources into a strength through sheer ingenuity. As you prepare your goods for the next day's market, it's clear that being a Phoenician merchant was a bit like playing chess with the gods of commerce. Every move mattered, and you had to think 10 steps ahead. Will your tin from Cornwall reach Tyre before the market saturates? Can you convince that Egyptian trader that your olive oil is worth its weight in papyrus? It's a constant game of strategy, luck, and a little bit of swagger. And there you have it, a glimpse into the economics of ancient Phoenician trade. It's a world where diplomacy and mathematics go hand in hand, and where the logistics of transporting snail dye could make or break your fortune. As you close up shop and prepare for another day, you're part of a legacy that's as vibrant as the dye that made your city famous. Stay tuned for more tales of Phoenician prowess, because the ancient world still has a few tricks up its sleeve, and we're just getting started. You close up shop and wander toward the docks, where the Phoenician ships barb like corks in a stormy sea. These aren't just any old vessels. Oh no, these are the sleek, state-of-the-art carriers that made your people the FedEx of the ancient world. With their slender hulls and towering masts, Phoenician ships were basically the Maseratis of maritime trade. They weren't just built for speed, they were built to outwit the competition, and let's be honest, the occasional pirate. Now, let's talk about the genius of Phoenician shipbuilding. These ships weren't just thrown together like some ancient DIY project. They were crafted with precision using cedar wood, which, as we've established, was the bay and say of building materials. Strong, durable, and a little bit glamorous. The design featured a keel that was as much about stability as it was about cutting through the Mediterranean waves like a hot knife through hummus. And let's not forget the Byzantine, which boasted 2 rows of oarsmen. This wasn't just about speed, it was about power, baby. Imagine a crew of 50 burly sailors rowing in perfect unison, propelling the ship forward like a well-oiled machine. It was enough to make Poseidon himself take notice. But as fabulous as these ships were, they weren't exactly unsinkable. The Mediterranean Sea was both a highway and a minefield, full of unpredictable weather. And yes, pirates. Those charming fellows weren't just legends from pirates of the Aegean. They were very real, and they weren't interested in playing nice. A successful voyage required not just skill, but a healthy dose of luck, or perhaps a few sacrifices to the gods. Whether it was a sudden squall or a band of marauding sea raiders, every trip was a roll of the dice. Consider this. The average journey from Tyre to Carthage was about 500 miles, and that's if the weather was on your side. And while the sea was a quicker route than hoofing it over land, it was a risky business. One storm could turn your cedar masterpiece into driftwood faster than you could say Poseidon's beard. It's no wonder sailors had a reputation for being a superstitious bunch. They'd do anything for a safe passage, from tossing a coin into the sea to offering up a sheep, or at least its less fortunate parts. And let's not sugarcoat the pirate problem. The ancient Mediterranean was a regular pirate's playground. These guys knew the sea routes like the back of their sunburned hands. They'd wait in ambush, ready to pounce on unsuspecting merchants. And while the Phoenicians were no strangers to a good fight, they were seasoned sailors, after all. Sometimes it was smarter to pay up and save your skin and your cargo for another day. Now, you might be wondering why anyone would risk their neck on the high seas. Well, the answer is simple: profit. Sea trade was the ancient version of high-stakes poker, a game where the winnings could be enormous, but so could the losses. A successful trade run could make you richer than a king's ransom, with exotic goods like ivory, spices, and precious metals lining your pockets. But a single storm or pirate attack could leave you destitute, cursing the day you ever laid eyes on a ship. The Phoenicians, however, were nothing if not pragmatic. Sea trade wasn't just a gamble, it was a calculated risk. They knew the odds and they played them well. The rewards were too great to pass up, and the risks, well, they were just part of the package. You didn't become a powerhouse of ancient trade by playing it safe. You took those cedar ships and sailed them into the unknown, because fortune, as they say, favors the bold. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the harbor, you find yourself reflecting on the delicate dance of maritime trade. It's a world of innovation and danger, where the line between success and disaster is as thin as a ship's hull. But that's what made it so exhilarating, right? The thrill of the chase, the promise of untold riches, the ever-present threat of ruin. It was all part of the game, and the Phoenicians were masters at playing it. So, was sea trade worth the risk? For the Phoenicians, the answer was a resounding yes. They knew that every voyage was a step into the unknown, but they also knew that the rewards were worth the gamble. The sea was unpredictable, yes, but it was also a gateway to untold opportunities, a vast, shimmering expanse of potential just waiting to be explored. And that, my friend, is what made it all worthwhile. As you watch the final rays of light disappear over the horizon, you realize that the story of Phoenician sea trade is far from over. There are still new routes to chart, new markets to explore, and new challenges to overcome. The sea, with all its dangers and delights, is calling, and the Phoenicians are more than ready to answer. So stay tuned, because this adventure is just getting started. The sea calls, and as the Phoenician ships glide into a foreign port, you can practically feel the buzz of opportunity in the air. Welcome to a world where the phrase cultural melting pot was coined long before modern-day globalization became a buzzword. Here, the port isn't just a place to unload goods. It's a vibrant crossroads where languages mix, traditions blend, and deities from different pantheons might just be sharing a drink at the local tavern. Let's dive into the scene. You're docking at a bustling port. Maybe Carthage, maybe Gades, modern-day Cadiz, perhaps one of the many Greek settlements. The exact location changes, but the experience remains remarkably consistent. Step off the ship, and you're greeted by a cacophony of voices, each with its own distinct accent. Traders from Egypt bartering with Greeks, locals haggling with Levantines, and somewhere in the background, the sound of someone trying to sell you a dubious relic. It's chaos, sure, but it's a beautiful kind of chaos, like a symphony that shouldn't work, but somehow does. Phoenicians, you see, were nothing if not adaptable. They were the original globalists, the ancient world's version of polyglots, speaking as many languages as necessary to close a deal. And let's not forget their polytheistic pragmatism. These savvy traders weren't about to let a little thing like religious dogma get in the way of commerce. Instead, they treated gods like trading cards, collect them all and hope for the best. See, the Phoenicians had this ingenious system. They would adopt local gods and customs wherever they went, which made them the ultimate chameleons of the ancient world. Imagine rolling up to a new city and seeing a market dedicated to the local deity. What do? You make an offering, say a quick prayer, and boom, you're in the community's good graces. No need to proselytize or convert, just a little bit of divine diplomacy. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just about fitting in or avoiding conflict. Phoenician polytheism was a business strategy as well. When you pray to the local gods, you're signaling to the locals, hey, we're one of you, let's do some business. It's like wearing the local sports team's jersey when visiting a new city. You might not know the first thing about the game, but you're instantly part of the tribe. And really, who's going to argue with a merchant that's got the gods on their side? Now, you might think this sounds a tad opportunistic, maybe even a touch cynical. But in a world where allegiances were as fickle as the Mediterranean weather, it was a strategy that worked wonders. The Phoenicians understood that in the marketplace of ideas and goods, flexibility was key. You don't become a powerhouse of trade by insisting your way is the only way. Instead, you adapt, you absorb, and you make sure your cargo of cedar and purple dye finds a welcoming home. Speaking of welcoming, these ports were more than just economic hubs. They were cultural candy stores. Picture rows of stalls lined with goods from across the known world, spices from the east, metals from the west, and textiles that would make any modern fashionista swoon. This was the ancient version of a world trade fair, where the Phoenicians played both hosts and guests, showcasing their goods while absorbing the best the world had to offer. And let's not overlook the social scene. It wasn't all business. There was plenty of pleasure to be had. Taverns where stories were swapped over cups of wine, festivals where you might find yourself dancing with a stranger from another land, and markets where haggling was an art form unto itself. The Phoenicians were experts at navigating these waters, literally and figuratively. They knew that every interaction was a chance to learn, to grow, and maybe to snag a new trade partner. So, what's the takeaway here? Phoenicians weren't just merchants. They were cultural ambassadors, spreading ideas and innovations like wildfire. Their ships didn't just carry goods. They carried stories, traditions, and inventions. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the interconnected world we know today. But let's not romanticize this entirely. For all their savvy, the Phoenicians were still products of their time. Their trade networks were built on a foundation of pragmatism and, at times, ruthlessness. Alliances could be as fleeting as friendships in a reality TV show. And while they were masters of diplomacy, they weren't above a little skullduggery if it meant securing a lucrative deal. As the sun sets over the harbor, casting long shadows on the bustling port, you can't help but marvel at the delicate dance of cultural exchange. The Phoenicians, with their polytheistic openness and mercantile cunning, managed to weave a tapestry that connected disparate cultures across the ancient world. They were the original global networkers, long before LinkedIn made it cool. So here you are, standing at the edge of a foreign port, a crossroads of commerce and culture. The air is thick with potential, and the possibilities are as endless as the horizon. The Phoenicians didn't just chart new waters. They charted new ways of thinking, proving that sometimes the best way to conquer the world is with an open mind and a well-stocked ship. And with that, you pack up your wares and prepare to set sail once more, ever ready to explore new horizons and forge new connections. After all, the sea, with its vast opportunities and hidden dangers, is calling. And like any true Phoenician, you're more than ready to answer. Stay tuned, because the adventure is far from over, and the next chapter is just beyond the horizon. As you pack up your wares and prepare to set sail once more, the Mediterranean breeze carries with it a sense of reflection. You're not just closing up shop for the day. You're stepping back to take a good, long look at the grand tapestry woven by Phoenician hands. These were the original jet-setters, minus the jets, and with a lot more wood and sail. Their trade routes were the threads that stitched together the ancient world, laying the groundwork for modern commerce and cross-cultural exchange. It's like the first draft of globalization, but with fewer corporate mergers and more bartering for fish sauce. Let's start with their legacy in the world of trade. The Phoenicians were nothing if not ambitious, and their routes stretched from the Levant to the Iberian Peninsula, a modest 300 miles if you're counting. Though I doubt they had a Fitbit to track their steps. They established colonies that became linchpins in the network of ancient commerce, places like Carthage, which didn't just grow. It exploded into a powerhouse, rivaling Rome itself at one point. Imagine that, a city born from trade that went toe-to-toe with an empire. It's like the mom-and-pop store that somehow outdoes the big-box retailer. But the real magic of Phoenician trade wasn't just in its breadth. It was in how it transformed the mundane into the magnificent. Goods weren't merely exchanged. They became carriers of culture and technology. Imagine olive oil not just as a cooking staple, but as a medium carrying Greek philosophy to distant shores. Your cedar wood wasn't just building material, it was a conveyance for Egyptian embalming secrets. The Phoenicians were the original cultural couriers, bringing the world a little closer with each transaction. Now, let's bust some myths wide open, because who doesn't love a little reality check with their bedtime story? One of the most enduring legends about the Phoenicians is their supposed monopoly on the coveted Tyrian purple dye. The color of royalty, extracted from the lowly murex snail. The story goes that they guarded this secret like it was their grandmother's recipe for baklava. But here's the kicker. While it's true that Tyrian purple was a status symbol, the idea of a monopoly is a bit, well, exaggerated. Other cultures dabbled in dye-making too. They just didn't have the same marketing budget. The notion that the Phoenicians were these shadowy figures hoarding secrets is as romantic as it is misleading. In reality, they were pragmatic. Sure, they kept some trade secrets, but they weren't above sharing knowledge if it meant a profitable partnership. Business is business, after all, and if a little knowledge exchange kept the silver shekels rolling in, so be it. It's a bit like modern tech companies, fiercely competitive, but still collaborating when it suits their bottom line. Speaking of myths, let's touch on the idea of Phoenician secrecy. It's a tantalizing thought, the cloak and dagger world of ancient trade, but the truth is more grounded. In a world where reputation was everything, maintaining trust was more valuable than any clandestine operation. You don't build a trade empire by double-crossing every partner. You do it by forging alliances that stand the test of time and tide. The Phoenicians understood that, and it's part of why their legacy endures. So, what does all this mean for us, the modern heirs to this ancient legacy? Well, if the Phoenicians taught us anything, it's that trade is more than just the exchange of goods. It's the exchange of ideas, cultures, and innovations. It's about opening doors, not just between markets, but between minds. They were the original networkers, creating connections that would influence civilizations long after their ships had docked for the last time. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting its final rays over the restless sea, you're left pondering the true impact of Phoenician merchants. They weren't just traders, they were trailblazers, setting a precedent for what it means to be a part of a global community. Their story reminds us that trade is a force of change, capable of transcending borders and shaping the future. It's a legacy that continues to resonate, proving that the more things change, the more they stay the same. In the end, the Phoenicians were more than just savvy businessmen. They were visionaries. They didn't just see the world as it was, they saw what it could be. And that, my friend, is a legacy worth remembering. As you drift off to sleep, let the whispers of the ancient world lull you into dreams of cedar forests and purple seas, of trade winds and distant shores. Because the story of the Phoenicians isn't just history. It's a testament to the enduring power of human ingenuity and the endless possibilities that arise when cultures collide. And who knows? Maybe tomorrow, with the wisdom of the past as your guide, you'll find your own path through the ever-changing tides of life.